You wake in the dark of a hut woven from hazel wattle and sealed with moss and clay, where the only window is a gap in the door, leather that shows nothing yet but the deep blue of the last hour before dawn. The air inside is cool and carries the scent of old wood smoke that is soaked into every rafter and every fold of the blanket you push aside as you sit up on a bed of dried bracken. Your feet find the packed earth floor, and you rise without hurry because there is no reason for hurry out here. Only the slow pull of habit that has shaped your mornings for more years than you care to count. You dip a wooden cup into the clay pot of spring water that stands by the doorpost and drink slowly, feeling the cold pass down your throat and spread through your chest while the first bird, a black bird somewhere in the oak behind the hut, begins its tentative call. You pull on a woolen tunic that still holds the warmth of last night, and lace up leather shoes that have shaped themselves to your feet over countless miles of forest floor, then push aside the leather flap and step out into the forest that is your home, your workshop, and the only world that truly matters to you now. The clearing around the hut is small, barely wider than the building itself, ringed by ancient oaks and younger beeches whose trunks rise like grey columns into a canopy still hidden in shadow. The grass here is sparse and flattened by your daily passing, with a narrow track leading away between two holly bushes that catch the first faint suggestion of light on their glossy leaves. You follow this path as you have followed it every morning, walking with a pace that matches the slow waking of the woods, your breath a soft cloud in the air that lingers for a moment before dissolving behind you. The ground underfoot is springy with leaf mold, the fallen leaves of many autumns layered so deep that your footsteps make almost no sound, a quietness you do not disturb because this hour belongs to the creatures that are only now stirring in the undergrowth. A wood mouse rustles briefly in a drift of dry beech husks, then falls silent as you pass. Further off, a jay calls once and then waits, as if listening for a reply that does not come. You know every tree along this path, not by names given in books, but by the feel of their bark, the angle of their branches, the places where their roots have lifted the path into gentle ridges that your feet navigate without thought. The track bends left around a fallen oak that has lain here longer than you have lived, its trunk now soft with moss and fungi that glow faintly white in the dimness, and you place your hand on the crumbling wood as you pass, a gesture so old and automatic that you barely notice it anymore. Beyond the fallen tree, the forest opens slightly into a wider glade where the coppice begins, and here the sky above is starting to pale from deep indigo to a grey that holds the promise of a muted sunrise somewhere behind the clouds. You pause for a moment, not because you are tired, but because this is the place where you always pause, where a small spring seeps from a bank of ferns and trickles across the path in a sheet so thin it is more like a glaze on the earth than a stream. You kneel, cup water in your palm, and splash it on your face, the cold shocking you gently into full wakefulness, while the ferns drip their collected dew onto the back of your neck, rising. You look around the glade and note, without particular interest, that the wood sorrel has closed its leaves for what remains of the night, that the wild garlic is beginning to send up new green shoots among the roots of the old hornbeam, that the air has in it a softness that speaks of spring advancing at its own deliberate pace. The path continues beyond the spring, leading you deeper into the part of the forest where you work, and as you walk, you listen to the sounds that are beginning to layer themselves into the morning. The drip of residual moisture from high branches, the distant knock of a great spotted woodpecker testing a dead limb, the whisper of your own sleeve brushing against hazel leaves as you pass between narrowing banks of undergrowth. The trees here grow closer together, their crowns interlacing overhead so that even when full daylight comes, this part of the wood will remain in a perpetual green twilight, a condition you have grown so used to that bright sun sometimes feels strange on the rare occasions you leave the forest's cover. The path forks at a lightning-struck ash tree whose split trunk has healed into two separate living halves, and you take the right fork without hesitating, because the left leads down to the stream where you sometimes fish, and today is not a fishing day. It is a kiln day, and your body knows the difference without needing to consult your mind. The right fork climbs slightly, the ground becoming drier underfoot with more sand and small stones that click together as you walk, and soon you begin to smell it. The faint, sweet, acrid scent of old charcoal, of wood smoke that has seeped into the soil itself over years of burning, the permanent perfume of your life's work. The clearing where your kiln stands is not large, but it is open, the trees held back by centuries of careful cutting, so that no spark could ever leap from kiln to living branch. The earth here is black in places, mixed with charcoal dust and small fragments that crunch under your feet like frozen snow, a dark layer that has built up season after season until the very ground seems to be made partly of your labor. The kiln itself stands at the center, a low dome of earth and turf that rises just above your own height, grey and silent now, its surface cracked in places from the last burn so that you can see the darker soil beneath. Around it lie the tools of your trade, a long iron rake with a wooden handle polished smooth by your hands, a flat shovel for spreading earth, a stack of turf squares cut from the forest edge and kept damp under a piece of old sacking, several clay plugs of different sizes for the vent holes, and a coil of rope that has no immediate purpose but has been there so long you no longer question its presence. A wooden lean-to against the largest oak shelters, a pile of dried kindling, a clay pot of ember carrying sand, and a log seat worn into a comfortable hollow where you spend many hours watching the kiln breathe. You walk around the kiln now, a slow circuit that is part inspection and part ritual, your hand trailing over the cool earth surface as you check for any holes that might need patching, any signs of settling or collapse after the last firing. The structure is sound, the earth crust intact except for the deliberate vent holes that are currently plugged with grass-filled clay stoppers, and you find nothing that needs your immediate attention, so you continue your circuit until you have completed 3 full turns, a number that pleases you for reasons you could not explain. Satisfied, you cross to the lean-to and sit on the log seat, your back against the oak's rough bark, and for a few minutes you simply watch the clearing fill with the gradual light of a day that promises to be overcast and still, a good day for kiln work, because wind is the enemy of an even burn. The forest around you has fully woken now, the birdsong a complex tapestry of robins and wrens, and the occasional harsh call of a nuthatch working its way down a trunk somewhere to your left, and you let these sounds wash over you without focusing on any single thread of the music. Your mind drifts as you sit, not to the king imprisoned in some distant castle you have never seen, nor to the armies that move across the land beyond your forest, but to the practical matters of your day, the coppice stool that needs cutting back, the cords of wood that must be checked for damp, the question of whether to build a new kiln floor or repair the old one. These thoughts rise and fall like the breathing of a sleeping animal, unhurried and without urgency, presenting themselves for your consideration and then retreating when you do not pursue them. You notice that a spider has built a web between 2 of the kindling sticks in the pile beside you, the silk catching the growing light and showing the intricate pattern of its making, and you watch the spider sit motionless at the center, waiting with a patience that matches your own. The day stretches ahead of you, long and quiet and full of simple tasks that will occupy your hands while your mind wanders through a landscape as familiar as the forest itself. You rise from the log seat, pick up the iron rake, simply because it feels right to have a tool in your hand, and walk toward the coppice to begin the first real work of the morning, leaving the clearing and the sleeping kiln behind you in the soft grey light that asks nothing and expects nothing and gives you the peace that only comes from a life lived wholly within the slow rhythms of the woods. The path to the coppice leads away from the sleeping kiln and into a section of the forest where the trees grow differently, not as tall single trunks, but as clusters of many stems rising from the same old stool, evidence of centuries of cutting and regrowth that has shaped the woodland into something between a wild place and a garden. You walk with the iron rake over your shoulder, its weight familiar and balanced, your feet following a track that is little more than a crease in the leaf litter, but is as clear to you as any paved road would be to a traveler elsewhere. The morning light has strengthened enough now to filter through the canopy in broad, diffuse shafts that illuminate patches of the forest floor in grey gold, and you pass through these pools of light one after another, your shadow appearing briefly on the ground before you and then fading as you step back into the shade. The air is still cool enough that you can see your breath when you exhale, but there is a warmth beginning to make itself felt where the sun touches your shoulders, a gentle promise of the afternoon to come. Around you the sounds of the morning continue their quiet pattern, the distant drumming of that same woodpecker still at work on his dead limb, the closer rustle of a squirrel investigating a beech mast buried last autumn, the sound of your own footsteps, which are a soft, rhythmic crush of dry leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig that makes you note the position of fallen branches for later clearing. You enter the coppice compartment through an almost invisible gap between two old hazel stools whose outer stems have grown together overhead to form a natural arch, and once you're inside, you feel the subtle change in the atmosphere that this part of the forest always holds. The light here is dimmer because the regrowth is dense. Hundreds of straight poles rising close together from massive ancient stools that might be 500 years old at their root, though the stems themselves are rarely more than 20. The ground beneath them is open and clear of undergrowth because the dense canopy of hazel leaves, not yet fully unfurled in this early part of the season, shades out most competitors, leaving only a sparse carpet of moss and the occasional spike of bluebell pushing through. You stop just inside the entrance and look around with the careful attention of someone who must decide where to begin, noting which stools have regrown to the right size for charcoal wood, which poles are straight enough to stack well, which sections of the compartment were last cut 2 years ago and are therefore still too green and thin for today's purpose. This assessment is not a matter of conscious analysis, but of something more like recognition, the same way you know a face you have seen many times, and your decision forms itself in your mind without any visible moment of choice. You walk to the third stool from the far boundary oak, a massive hazel cluster with stems ranging from the thickness of your thumb to the thickness of your wrist, and you lean the rake against a neighboring birch before kneeling beside the stool to begin your work. The first tool you draw from the leather sheath at your belt is the billhook, its curved blade sharp enough to shave the hair from your arm and its wooden handle worn dark by years of gripping. You select a stem that is straight and true, about 3 inches through at its base, and you cut it with a single slicing stroke delivered at the correct angle just above the stool so that the new growth will sprout cleanly from the cut and form the next generation of poles for some future burner who will stand where you stand now. The cut makes a sound that is both soft and decisive, a whisper of parting wood fibers, and the pole falls sideways into the crook of a neighboring stem where you catch it with your free hand and lay it carefully on the ground. You move to the next pole and the next, working your way around the stool in a slow circuit that leaves a neat ring of cut stems on the moss, while the stool itself emerges from its thicket of growth to show the ancient gnarled base from which all this life has sprung. The Frenin tertiary can note in the most comfortable way, each cut like a note in a song you've sung things, the way the moss on the north side of the stool is thicker and greener than on the south. A small fact you have noticed many times before and always pondered briefly before letting it go. The memory of a burn 3 years ago that produced particularly fine heavy charcoal because the wood had been cut in a dry spell exactly like this one. The question of whether it will rain, which you are beteister and braven of scare the when the stool is fully cut, you stand and stretch, feeling the muscles in your lower back loosen, then you begin the process of trimming each pole of its side branches and smaller twigs. You work standing now with the billhook moving in quick, practiced strokes, stripping each pole clean and leaving a growing pile of brushwood that you will later gather and tie into faggots for kindling at the kiln. The wood you are preparing is hazel mostly, but with some birch and a few stems of field maple that have seeded themselves among the stools, and you handle each species slightly differently because you know from long experience that birch catches fire faster and burns hotter, while hazel makes a more even, long-lasting charcoal that the ironworkers prefer. You sort the trimmed poles as you go, laying the thickest ones in one pile for the center of the kiln where the heat will be greatest, the medium stems in another pile for the main body of the stack, and the thinnest in a third pile for the outer edge where the burn is slower and cooler. This sorting is so automatic that your hands seem to do it without your mind's involvement, and you find yourself watching them work with the same mild interest you might give to a skilled animal going about its business. The morning has moved on while you were cutting, the light now much brighter, though still softened by cloud and canopy, and you feel the first small prickle of sweat on your forehead as you carry armloads of trimmed poles from the stool to the stack you are building in the center of the compartment's main track. This track is wide enough for a small cart, though you never use one, and it runs straight between the coppice stools like a corridor of open ground where the moss grows thicker, because the deer walk here at night and their hooves break up the soil and scatter seeds. Your stack of cordwood grows slowly, layer by careful layer, as you lay each pole, with the cut ends all facing the same direction, so that when you come to build the kiln, you will be able to select exactly the right length without searching. The pile is a neat and pleasing thing, the different colors of the wood creating subtle variations. The pale grey-brown of the hazel bark, the darker peeling skin of the birch, the smooth olive green of the maple stems that are still young. A small beetle, black and shiny like a polished bead, climbs over a piece of hazel and then takes flight with a tiny whir of wings, and you watch it go without pausing in your work. From somewhere deeper in the forest, beyond the coppice boundary, comes the sound of a raven calling, a low, throaty croak that echoes among the tree trunks and slowly fades. You have not seen another person in this part of the wood for many days, though you know there are other burners and woodcutters and charcoal carriers who work sections of the forest not far from yours, and you know also that the war beyond the trees has disrupted many of the usual patterns of trade and movement. But here in the coppice these facts feel as distant as the moon, as irrelevant to the immediate task as the politics of ancient Rome, and you continue trimming and stacking while the raven calls again and then falls silent. The silence that follows is not total, because the forest is never truly silent. Its quiet moments filled with the sound of leaves shifting, water moving somewhere underground, the almost inaudible creak of branches rubbing together high above, but it is a silence deep enough to hold a thought without interruption, and you find that your thoughts have become slow and simple and peaceful, concerned only with the wood in your hands and the stack growing neatly beside the track. When you have cleared all the poles from the stool and stacked them, you gather the brushwood and bind it into bundles using thin strips of hazel bark that you peel from a fresh cut stem with a quick twist of your fingers. The bark strips are tough and flexible, and you wind them around each faggot 3 times before tucking the end under itself in a knot that will hold but can be undone with a single pull when you need to use the kindling. You lean the faggots against the base of the birch tree, where they will stay dry and be easy to find when you walk back this way later in the week. Then you straighten up fully for the first time in what feels like hours, pressing your hands against the small of your back and looking around at the work you have done. The cut stool looks raw but healthy, its new wounds already beginning to seal with sap, and you know that in a few weeks the first shoots will appear, tiny green buds that will grow into new poles and eventually into another crop of charcoal wood for another burner in another time. The track is clear of debris because you have been tidy in your work, and the stack of cordwood is straight and tall and ready for the next stage of its journey from living tree to charcoal pile. You walk back along the coppice track to the place where you left your iron rake, its handle still leaning against the birch, and you pick it up and rest it once more over your shoulder. The day is now fully into morning, the light steady and unchanging under the grey ceiling of cloud, and the air has warmed enough that you no longer see your breath, though you still feel the coolness in the air when you breathe in deeply. You pause at the entrance to the coppice compartment where the 2 hazel stools form their natural arch, and you look back once at the stack of wood you have built, noting with quiet satisfaction its order and readiness. Then you turn and follow the path back toward the kiln clearing, your pace unhurried, your mind already moving ahead to the next stage of the process that has defined your days for so long that you can no longer separate the work from the man who does it. Behind you, the forest closes around the coppice track and the cut stool and the stacked wood, holding it all in its quiet, patient way until you return to carry the cordwood to the kiln and begin the transformation that will turn these straight green poles into the black, brittle charcoal that the iron furnaces need and that your life revolves around in its slow and steady turning. You return to the kiln clearing with the iron rake still resting across your shoulder, and the first thing you notice is that the light has shifted subtly while you were in the coppice. The grey ceiling of cloud thinning just enough to let a paler, brighter glow wash over the open space and pick out the texture of the earth-covered kiln mound standing at its center. The old burn structure looks different now than it did in the early dimness, the cracks in its surface more visible as fine dark lines tracing across the grey-brown crust, and you make a mental note to patch those before you light the new charge, though that task is still days away. For now, your attention shifts to the space beside the old kiln, where you will build the new stack. a flat circle of packed earth and charcoal dust that has been the floor of many previous burns and is as level and smooth as a threshing floor. You walk to this spot and stand at its edge, looking down at the dark ground and letting your mind measure distances and angles that you have never written down but know as precisely as you know the shape of your own hands. The new stack will be slightly larger than the last one because the coppice has yielded well this season, the poles straight and abundant. And you calculate without conscious arithmetic that you will need about 3 cartloads of wood to build a mound that will burn evenly for 8 or 9 days and produce 20 sacks of good heavy charcoal at the end. This calculation is not numbers in your head, but rather a feeling in your body, a sense of proportion and mass that comes from having done this same thing in this same place more times than you can remember. You set the rake down with its tines pressed into the soil so the handle stands upright, and you begin the preparatory work of clearing and leveling the kiln floor, walking slowly around the circle with a flat wooden shovel to scrape away any weeds or roots that have pushed up through the hard-packed surface since the last burn. The shovel makes a soft scraping sound as it moves across the ground, a sound that is almost like the forest breathing, and you work with a gentle rhythm that sends small puffs of charcoal dust into the air where they hang for a moment before settling back onto your boots. The circle you are defining is about 10 feet across, and you walk its circumference many times as you scrape and smooth, your path wearing a faint track into the surrounding soil that will disappear under the new layer of earth you will spread later. When the floor is as clean and flat as you can make it, you fetch the old sacking that covers your pile of turf squares, and you lay the squares around the perimeter of the circle, not yet ready to use them, but wanting them close at hand for when you will need to seal the vents during the burn. The turf is still damp from its storage under the sack, and it smells of cool soil and the tiny roots of grasses that have begun to regrow in the darkness, pale white threads probing the underside of each square like delicate veins. You place 6 squares equally spaced around the circle and then stand back to look at your arrangement, adjusting one that is slightly out of line and noting with quiet satisfaction the symmetry of your preparation. Now the real work begins, and you walk back along the track to the coppice to retrieve the first load of cordwood. The path is so familiar by now that your feet find their way without any need for your eyes, and you let your gaze wander upward into the canopy where the leaves are beginning to show the first hints of their full spring green, a color so fresh it seems almost to glow against the grey sky. At the coppice entrance, you pass under the arch of hazel and see your stack of trimmed poles waiting exactly as you left it, the different sizes sorted, and the cut ends all facing the track, and you bend to gather an armload of the thickest poles, the ones destined for the center of the kiln where the heat will be fiercest. The wood is heavy in your arms, still green and full of sap, and you carry it back along the path with a steady, measured pace that does not strain your back because you have learned over long years how to carry a load in balance with your own body's center. At the kiln floor, you lay the first poles down in the very center of the circle, arranging them parallel to each other like the foundation of a strange wooden floor, and then you return to the coppice for the next armload. This journey repeats many times, the quiet walk along the track, the bending to gather wood, the careful selection of the right pieces for each stage of the build, the return with the load, and the precise placement of each pole on the growing structure. Your mind drifts during these repetitions, not to anything specific, but into a state of calm attention that is almost like the state of the forest itself, watchful but unthinking, present but not focused on any single thing. When you have carried enough of the thick central poles to the kiln floor, you begin the actual construction of the stack, starting with the core that will be the heart of the fire. You take the first pole, a straight length of hazel about 4 feet long and as thick as your forearm, and you stand it upright in the exact center of the circle, pressing its base into the soft black earth just enough to hold it steady. Around this central pole, you begin placing other poles in a tight circle, each one standing upright with its base on the ground and its top leaning slightly inward so that they all converge toward the center like the ribs of a vast wooden cone. The placement of each pole requires a moment of judgment. You look at the gap it will fill, you measure the length against its neighbors, you rotate it slightly in your hands to find the side that will sit flattest against the poles already in place, and then you set it with a firm push that seats it in the soil. The circle grows outward as you work, each new pole adding to the diameter of the core until you have a ring of upright logs about 3 feet across, standing like a crowd of wooden soldiers all facing inward toward the central pole. The spaces between the poles are not empty, but are themselves part of the design, channels through which the fire will draw air upward from the base vents, and you eye these spaces with the critical attention of someone who knows that the success of the burn depends on the balance between density and airflow. Too tight, and the fire will smother; too loose, and it will burn too fast and consume the wood instead of transforming it slowly into charcoal. With the core circle standing firm, you turn your attention to filling its interior, taking the shorter pieces you sorted earlier and dropping them vertically into the central cavity so that they stand packed together like a bundle of kindling sticks. These shorter pieces are offcuts and crooked lengths that would not fit neatly in the outer walls, but here in the center they serve perfectly, providing the mass of wood that will gradually carbonize as the fire moves inward from the edges. You fill the core until the shorter pieces rise almost to the height of the surrounding uprights. Then you reach in with both hands and wriggle the pieces slightly so they settle into a tighter, more compact bundle with fewer large air gaps. The feel of the wood under your hands is familiar and comforting. The smooth bark of the hazel still cool from the morning air, the slightly rougher texture of the birch lengths, the occasional knobbly protrusion of a branch collar that you position to face inward where it will not interfere with the layers yet to come. When the core is packed to your satisfaction, you step back and walk around the whole structure, checking that the upright circle is still symmetrical and that no single pole is leaning too far in or out of line. You adjust a few poles with gentle nudges, the way you might straighten a picture on a wall, and then you nod once to yourself, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture of approval. The next stage is the horizontal layering, and for this you return to the pile of medium thickness poles that you have stacked near the kiln floor. You pick up a pole and lay it across the top of the upright circle, bridging the gap between two of the standing logs so that it rests horizontally, with its ends projecting slightly beyond the vertical ring. This horizontal pole becomes the foundation of a new layer, and you continue placing poles side by side around the circumference, each one laid horizontally, so that its inner end rests on the central packed core and its outer end extends beyond the upright circle by a hand's width. The horizontal poles form a ring that slightly overhangs the vertical wall beneath it, creating a subtle outward step that will be repeated many times as the stack grows taller, and each new ring is laid with the poles rotated slightly so that the joints between them do not align with the joints in the ring below. A technique that you know intuitively strengthens the whole structure, just as a brick wall is stronger when the bricks are staggered. Your hands move with a patience that has been cultivated over decades, never rushing, never forcing a piece that does not fit naturally, pausing often to select the next pole from the pile with a careful consideration of its length and thickness and how it will sit among its neighbors. The stack grows gradually taller, ring by ring, each new horizontal layer stepping slightly outward so that the whole mound begins to take on a low, rounded profile, wider at the base and narrowing slowly toward a top that does not yet exist because you are only a third of the way up and there are many hours of building ahead. The forest around the clearing watches you work in its silent way. The beeches standing at the edge of the open space like tall grey sentinels whose leaves rustle softly whenever the lightest breeze moves through the canopy. A robin has arrived to investigate the disturbed earth where you scraped the kiln floor, and it hops about in short, jerky movements, cocking its head to peer at the soil for worms or grubs that your scraping might have exposed. You notice the bird without pausing in your work, its red breast a bright spot of color in the muted browns and greens of the clearing, and you find its presence companionable in a way that does not require any interaction, just a shared occupancy of the same small space in the vast forest. The robin stays for a long while, finding several small morsels and flying up to a low beech branch to eat them, then returning to the kiln floor for more searching before eventually flitting off into the undergrowth with a flash of its tail and a brief call that sounds like a question. You continue laying horizontal poles, and now the stack is chest high, the rounded form clearly visible, and you have to reach up slightly to place the poles at the top of the current ring because the structure has grown taller than your own waist. The higher you build, the more careful you must be about the overhang, making sure that the outward step of each new ring is small enough to keep the whole structure stable but large enough to give the mound its characteristic dome shape that will hold the earth covering without collapsing inward under its own weight. The morning has passed into early afternoon while you built, a transition you notice not by any clock, but by the subtle movement of the grey light across the clearing, the shadows of the beeches shifting their angles on the ground as the sun behind the clouds travels its invisible arc. Your stomach tells you it is time to eat, and you pause in your building to walk to the lean-to, where you have left a cloth bundle containing a flat oat cake and a small wedge of hard cheese wrapped in a dock leaf. You sit on the log seat with your back against the oak and eat slowly, chewing each bite until it is soft and flavorful, your gaze resting on the half-built kiln stack that stands waiting for your return. The oat cake is dry but nutty, the cheese sharp and crumbly, and you wash them down with water from the clay bottle that hangs on a peg under the lean-to roof. While you eat, you listen to the sounds of the forest in its midday quiet, the bird song less intense now than it was at dawn, but still present as a background murmur, the distant cooing of a wood pigeon, the most prominent note along with the occasional buzz of a fly exploring the edge of the clearing. The rest is brief but sufficient, and soon you brush the crumbs from your tunic and stand up, your body refreshed and ready for the afternoon's labor. The building continues, and now the stack is above your head, the top of the dome beginning to close inward as you reduce the diameter of each successive ring so that the whole structure tapers toward a central point. Reaching the top requires you to stand on a sturdy section of log that you roll into place beside the stack, a temporary platform that raises you just enough to place the highest poles without overreaching. The work here is slower because the angles are steeper, and each piece must be chosen with the closure of the dome in mind. Shorter poles selected for the smaller rings, the inward tilt of each piece judged so that the final opening at the very top will be just the right size for the lighting vent. Your hands are now stained dark with charcoal dust from handling the wood that has rubbed against your old smoky clothes, and you wipe them occasionally on a rag tucked into your belt, but the stain is permanent for now and will remain until you wash properly at the spring. The afternoon wears on in the same steady rhythm of selection, placement, adjustment, and step back to check, a rhythm so deeply ingrained that you can maintain it without fatigue, your body moving through the familiar patterns while your thoughts drift across the surface of your mind like clouds across the grey sky. You think about the burn to come, about the way the smoke will curl from the vents in the first few hours, about the subtle signs that tell you whether the fire is drawing well or struggling, about the long nights of watching that lie ahead. And these thoughts are not anxious but rather calmly anticipatory, the way one might think about a journey that has been made many times before and holds no surprises. Finally, as the afternoon light begins to take on the first faint indication of its eventual decline toward evening, you place the last pole at the very top of the dome, a short, thin length of hazel that fits into the remaining opening and leaves a gap no larger than your fist directly in the center of the crown. This gap is the eye of the kiln, the place where you will introduce the first embers when it is time to light the charge, and you look at it with a sense of completion that is quiet and private and needs no outward expression. You step down from the log platform and push it aside with your foot, then you walk slowly around the finished stack, inspecting it from every angle, noting the even curve of the dome, the tight packing of the horizontal rings, the way the whole structure seems to hunch on the ground like a sleeping animal waiting to be woken. The beeches stand around the clearing as silent as ever, their grey trunks catching the last of the day's light and holding it in the smoothness of their bark, and you have the sense, as you sometimes do at moments of completion, that the trees have been watching your work and approving it in their wordless way. You pick up the iron rake and the flat shovel and put them back in their places under the lean-to. Then you cover the remaining turf squares with the old sacking and sweep the area around the new stack with a broom made of bound birch twigs, clearing away the bits of bark and wood chips that have accumulated during the building. The clearing is tidy now, ready for the next stage, and the kiln stack stands at its center like an offering to the forest or a promise of the charcoal that will come from its slow transformation. You stand for a moment in the fading light with your hands resting on the handle of the broom, looking at what you have built, and then you turn and walk toward the path that leads back to your hut, leaving the kiln to settle and season in the quiet night while the first stars begin to appear through the thinning gaps in the clouds above the clearing, where the beeches wait and the earth holds fast around the wood. that will soon give up its smoke and become something new. The morning comes with a low mist that has risen from the forest floor during the night and now hangs in layers among the trees, softening every outline and dampening every sound so that the clearing feels more enclosed than usual, more separate from the wider world that lies beyond the beeches. You arrive at the kiln clearing with the flat wooden shovel in your hand and an old leather bucket in the other, the bucket swinging slightly as you walk and making a faint creak where its handle rubs against the iron ring. The new kiln stack stands exactly as you left it the evening before, its dome of bare wood pale against the darker background of the trees, the small eye at its crown, still open to the grey sky like a pupil awaiting light. You set down the bucket and the shovel beside the stack, and then you stand for a moment looking at the structure you have built, not with pride exactly, but with a sense of readiness, the feeling that the wood has settled overnight and is now prepared for its second skin of earth. The morning is still and cool, the mist drifting in slow currents that brush against your face with a touch as light as cobweb, and you know from long experience that this damp weather is ideal for the earth covering, because the soil will pack better when it holds some moisture, and the crust will dry slowly without cracking in the heat of a sun that today remains hidden behind the uniform grey above. You begin by walking to the edge of the clearing, where the ground rises slightly into a low bank that has been your source of covering earth for as long as you have worked this kiln. The bank is not a natural feature, but the accumulated result of years of digging, a shallow excavation that has gradually moved backward into the tree line as you have taken soil from its face season after season, and now it forms a low cliff, about waist-high, with roots from the nearest beech hanging over its edge like the eaves of a thatched roof. The soil here is a good heavy loam, reddish-brown and full of tiny stones that help it hold together when packed, and you set to work with the shovel, cutting slices from the bank face and dropping them into the leather bucket. The shovel blade slides into the earth with a soft, gritty sound, and you use your foot to press it deeper when you encounter a particularly compacted layer, leaning your weight onto the blade and then levering backward to break the soil free. Each bucket load is heavy, and you carry it back to the kiln with both hands, the handle of the bucket digging into your palm in a way that is familiar and not uncomfortable, and you tick the soil onto the ground in a growing mound beside the stack. This journey repeats many times: the walk to the bank, the cutting and filling, the return with the loaded bucket, the tipping of the soil. Amid each repetition, the mound of fresh earth grows larger, while the hollow in the bank face depends almost imperceptibly, a few more inches of forest floor relocated to serve a new purpose. When you have enough fresh loam to begin, you fetch the old sack of charcoal dust that you have saved from previous burns, a fine black powder that has been sifted through a coarse cloth and stored dry under the lean-to in a clay pot with a wooden lid. You pour a measure of this dust onto the pile of new soil, judging the proportion by the color it makes as it falls, a darkening of the reddish-brown to a deeper, richer shade that you know will hold heat better than plain earth alone. The charcoal dust is so fine it puffs into the air as you pour, and you turn your head aside to avoid breathing it in, waiting a moment for the cloud to settle before you begin mixing the two materials together. You mix with the shovel, turning the pile over and over, cutting into it from the sides and folding the outer soil into the center, where the charcoal dust lies in dark streaks that gradually blend into a uniform color. When the mixing is done, you have a pile of dark, smooth earth that smells of old wood smoke and clean rain, a smell that is the fundamental scent of your life's work, and one that you have long ceased to notice consciously, even though it is always present in your clothes, and in your skin, and in the air of the clearing itself. The mixed earth is slightly damp from the moisture in the bank soil, and it clumps together when you squeeze a handful of it, holding its shape for a moment before crumbling apart, which is exactly the consistency you want for the covering. Now the true work of the day begins, and you fill the leather bucket with the first load of prepared earth and carry it to the base of the kiln stack. You have no trowel for this work, only your bare hands and the flat shovel, and you prefer it this way because your hands can feel the thickness of the layer you are applying in a way that any tool would obscure. You scoop up a double handful of the dark earth and press it directly against the lowest ring of horizontal poles, working it into the gaps between the logs with your fingers and smoothing it outward in a layer about the thickness of your palm. The earth is cool and slightly gritty against your skin, and you work it methodically from left to right around the base of the stack, moving slowly on your knees so that you can apply pressure evenly and ensure that every crevice between the poles is filled. The first band of earth forms a dark collar around the very bottom of the kiln, sealing the joint where the wood meets the ground, and you pat it firm with the flat of your hand before rising to fetch another bucket load. The work is repetitive but not monotonous, because each handful of earth requires a slightly different touch depending on the shape of the gaps it must fill and the angle of the logs beneath it. And your hands are constantly making tiny adjustments, pressing harder here where a hollow needs filling, smoothing more gently there where the wood rises close to the surface. As you work your way upward around the curved dome of the stack, you have to change your position more frequently, sometimes crouching, sometimes standing, sometimes climbing onto the log platform to reach the higher sections that are above your head. The earth covering grows in bands, each new strip overlapping the one below it, so that the whole surface will be seamless when complete. And you work with a steady pace that does not hurry, because hurrying would leave thin patches and uneven thickness that could cause the crust to fail during the burn. The covering must be thick enough to hold in the heat and keep out the air except at the deliberate vents, but not so thick that it will crack and fall away under its own weight, and you know the right thickness by feel, by the way the earth resists your pressing fingers, by the solid sound it makes when you pat it with the shovel blade flat. The smell of the damp earth rises around you as you work, clean and mineral and faintly sweet with the decay of old leaves that were part of the bank soil, and mixed with it is the charcoal scent from the dust you added, so that the whole clearing now smells like the floor of a forest after a very old, very small fire has been extinguished by rain. The mist has begun to thin as the morning progresses, lifting from the ground and dissolving into the canopy where it still clings to the highest branches in ragged wisps, but the air remains humid and the earth on your hands stays workable and does not dry out between bucket loads. The dome is half covered now, its lower portion a smooth, dark mound, while its upper portion is still bare wood, showing the pale bark of the hazel and birch poles, and the contrast makes the kiln look like something emerging from the earth rather than something being buried in it. You pause to rest for a moment, straightening your back and wiping your forehead with the sleeve of your tunic, leaving a smear of dark soil across your skin that you do not notice. During this rest, you walk around the kiln and inspect the work you have done so far, running your hand over the earth's surface to feel for any soft spots or cracks that need attention before you continue. The surface is firm and cool, slightly rough under your palm like the skin of an elephant you once saw in a traveling show many years ago, and you find no flaws that need correction, so you walk back to the earth pile and fill the bucket again. The robin has returned, or perhaps a different robin, and it watches you from the same low beech branch with its head tilted to one side, its bright eye following your movements as you carry the bucket back to the kiln and resume your work. You have grown so accustomed to the birds and the small creatures of the clearing that you register their presence without really seeing them, the way you register the position of the sun without consciously looking at the sky, and the robin's company feels as natural and unremarkable as the presence of the trees themselves. You move higher now, covering the upper third of the dome where the curve steepens toward the crown, and here the work requires more care because the angle means the earth wants to slide downward under its own weight. You press it firmly into the gaps between the poles, using the shovel blade to hold a load of earth in place while you pack it with your hands, building up the layer gradually until it holds its position without slumping. The final section around the very top of the dome, where the small eye remains open, needs particular attention because this is where the first heat of the fire will emerge when you light the charge, and the earth here must be thick enough to withstand the initial rush of flame without cracking, but thin enough to allow the smoke to find its way out through the deliberate vent. You leave the eye itself open, a dark hole about the size of your fist in the very center of the crown, and you build up the earth around it in a small raised lip that will direct the smoke upward like a tiny chimney. When the last handful of earth has been pressed into place, you step down from the log platform and look at the completed covering with the same quiet assessment you've given every stage of this process. The kiln is now a smooth, dark dome, the color of wet earth after rain, and it sits in the center of the clearing like a natural feature of the landscape, a small hill that has always been there and will always be there, patient and silent and waiting. But the covering is not finished yet, because the deliberate vents must be formed, and this is a task that requires its own careful attention. You take the iron rod that hangs from a nail on the lean-to post, a length of metal about as thick as your thumb and worn smooth at one end, from being pushed into countless earth coverings over the years. Starting at the base of the kiln on the side facing away from the prevailing wind, you push the rod through the fresh earth crust at a downward angle, working it gently back and forth until it penetrates through to the wood inside and creates a small tunnel about the diameter of 2 fingers. You withdraw the rod carefully, leaving a neat circular hole, and then you move a few paces around the circumference and make another vent, and then another, spacing them evenly around the base at the level of the ground. These lower vents will draw air into the kiln when the fire is burning, feeding the slow combustion from below, and their placement is crucial because an uneven arrangement will cause the fire to burn unevenly and produce poor half-burned charcoal on one side and ash on the other. You count the vents as you make them, though you do not need to count because your body knows the correct number from the feel of the spacing, and you finish with 8 lower vents evenly distributed around the base. Then you make 4 upper vents, higher on the dome and spaced between the lower ones, and these will serve as outlets for the smoke and steam that the fire produces in its early stages before the wood begins to carbonize properly. Each upper vent is angled slightly differently from the lower ones, pointing more outward than downward, and you shape each one with the same careful attention, withdrawing the rod slowly so that the walls of the tunnel stay smooth and do not collapse inward. When all the vents are made, you gather the turf squares from where you laid them around the perimeter yesterday, and you place one beside each vent, ready to be used as a plug when the time comes to close off the airflow and slow the burn. The turf squares are still damp and cool, their grass tops beginning to yellow slightly from being stooled away from the light, and you position them with the grass side up so that they will be easy to grip when you need to push them into the vent holes in the dark or in the smoke of a burn that is running hotter than expected. The final touch is to sweep the ground around the kiln clean of any spilled earth or debris, using the birch twig broom to smooth the packed floor of the clearing until it is as tidy as a cottage floor. You gather the leftover earth that was not used in the covering and carry it back to the bank, spreading it along the face to fill in the hollow you dug earlier and leaving the bank looking almost as it did before, just slightly reshaped and renewed. The tools go back to their places under the lean-to. The shovel hung from its peg, the bucket turned upside down to keep out any rain that might come, the iron rod replaced on its nail, the broom leaned against the oak trunk where it will be handy for the next sweeping. The clearing is now in perfect order, the kiln covered and vented and ready for the fire. The earth surface dark and smooth and studded with its circle of small dark holes that look like the openings of burrows made by some careful and methodical animal. You stand at the edge of the clearing for a while, looking at the completed kiln with a feeling that is too deep and too familiar to be called satisfaction. The dome of earth seems to belong here now, as much a part of the forest as the beeches and the oaks and the moss on the stones. And the fact that you made it with your own hands feels both significant and entirely ordinary, like the fact that a bird builds its nest or a spider spins its web. The mist has fully lifted while you worked, and the canopy above is now visible as a grey-green ceiling, the leaves stirring occasionally in a breeze that is too light to feel on your skin, but strong enough to make the highest branches sway. The day is moving into afternoon, and you realize that you have not eaten since the early morning, your stomach suddenly making its presence known with a small hollow ache. You walk to the lean-to and find the remains of yesterday's oatcake in the cloth bundle, breaking off a piece and eating it slowly while you sit on the log seat and let your body rest after the hours of lifting and carrying and pressing earth into place. The robin has gone now, replaced by a pair of long-tailed tits that flicker through the lower branches of the beech with tiny, high-pitched calls that sound like the ringing of very small bells. You watch them without really watching, your gaze unfocused, and you let your mind drift across the surface of the afternoon in the same way the long-tailed tits drift through the branches, without direction and without purpose, just moving. The earth covering will need a day or two to dry and settle before you can light the kiln, and you know that tomorrow will be a day of small tasks, checking the cords of wood for damp, mending a worn spot on your tunic, sharpening the billhook on the grinding stone that sits beside the spring, perhaps walking to the iron bloomery to see if the furnace master needs any early charcoal for a small melt. These thoughts arrange themselves in your mind without urgency. A loose schedule will unfold in its own time and may change depending on the weather, or your mood, or some small event that cannot be foreseen. For now, the kiln stands ready, and the clearing is quiet, and the forest holds you in its slow, patient embrace, asking nothing and offering everything. You finish the last of the oat cake and brush the crumbs from your lap. Then you rise from the log seat and walk slowly around the kiln one more time, checking the vents with a casual eye, noting the way the earth's surface has already begun to lighten in color as the moisture evaporates from its outermost layer. The dome will be a paler brown by evening, and by tomorrow it will be dry to the touch and ready to receive the fire that will transform the wood inside into the black, brittle charcoal that is the only product of your labor and the only currency you need in the quiet economy of the forest. You pick up the empty water bottle and the cloth bundle that held your food, and you leave the clearing with the same slow, measured pace with which you arrived, walking back along the path through the beeches and the oaks while the afternoon light begins its long, slow decline toward evening and the kiln waits behind you in the silence of the clearing, a dark mound under the grey sky, holding its charge of wood in patient darkness until the day when you will wake it with fire and begin the long watching that is the truest part of your craft. The morning of the lighting arrives with a sky that is neither fully clear nor fully clouded, but covered in a high, thin veil of grey that diffuses the sunlight into a soft, even glow without shadows, the kind of day you have always preferred for starting a new burn, because the air is settled and the wind is almost nothing. You wake earlier than usual, not from any sense of urgency, but because your sleep has grown light in the final hours, your body knowing without being told that this is the day when the kiln will be woken. Outside the hut, the forest is quiet, with the particular stillness that comes just before dawn. The birds not yet singing, and the air cool enough to raise the fine hairs on your forearms as you walk to the spring and splash water on your face. You drink deeply from the clay cup, then fill the leather bottle and sling it over your shoulder, because you will not leave the kiln clearing for many hours once the fire is lit, and you want water close at hand. The path to the clearing is familiar beneath your feet even in the last of the dark, and you walk it with the iron pot of embers cradled in both hands against your chest. The pot warms through its thick clay walls, and the embers inside still glowing from the fire you kindled in the hut half an hour ago and then let burn down to a bed of steady red coals. The warmth of the pot spreads through your tunic and into your skin, a small comfort against the early chill, and you walk with the careful, measured pace of someone carrying something precious that must not be jostled or spilled. The clearing is dim when you arrive, the dome of the kiln a darker shape against the dark trees, and you set the iron pot down on the flat stone you placed beside the kiln for this very purpose 2 days ago while the earth covering was still drying. You then light the small oil lantern that hangs from a hook on the lean-to post, and its flame pushes back the dimness enough for you to see the surface of the kiln clearly, to make out the dark circles of the vents and the smooth curve of the earth crust that has dried over the past days to a pale grey-brown, the color of a dried riverbed. You kneel beside the kiln and place your palm flat against its surface, feeling the coolness of the earth and knowing that inside the wood is cold and dead and waiting, the sap still sealed in the green poles, the whole structure dormant like a seed in winter. The moment before lighting is always the same, a pause in which you feel the weight of the craft you inherited from the old burner who taught you when you were barely old enough to lift the billhook, a man whose name you still speak sometimes when you are alone and the burn is going well, a quiet word of thanks to the dead. You place your ham flat on the kiln surface one more time. Then you rise and begin the final preparations. The first task is to check every vent and ensure that the turf plugs are sitting correctly beside each hole, ready to be used when the time comes to close off the airflow. You walk around the kiln slowly, your lantern held low, and you touch each vent hole with a finger, feeling the smoothness of the tunnel walls where the iron rod passed through, checking that no loose earth has fallen in to obstruct the opening. The vents are all clear and the turf plugs are all in place, so you return to the top of the kiln where the small eye at the crown waits open to the sky, a dark circle in the pale surface like the center of the target. Beside this eye, you have placed a bundle of the driest kindling you possess, thin shavings of birch bark and split twigs of dead pine that will catch fire almost instantly and carry the flame down into the heart of the stack. You crouch on the log platform beside the crown and arrange the kindling in a loose pile directly over the eye, not blocking it, but bridging across it, so that the embers you place will sit atop the kindling and draw air up through the open shaft from the base vents below. The arrangement is precise but simple. A nest of papery bark and fine twigs that feels almost weightless in your hands, and when you are satisfied with its shape, you climb down and fetch the iron pot of embers from its stone. The transfer of the embers is the most delicate moment of the entire process, and you perform it with the slow care of someone who knows that haste here would mean starting again from nothing. You lift the clay lid from the iron pot, and a faint red glow spills out, illuminating your face from below and warming your cheeks, and you use a pair of long iron tongs to select a single ember about the size of a walnut, blowing steadily at its heart, with a deep orange color that pulses almost imperceptibly as the air touches it. You transfer this ember to the nest of kindling atop the kiln eye, placing it gently in the very center where the birch bark is thinnest and most eager to burn. And then you select a second ember and place it beside the first, and then a third, until you have a small cluster of glowing coals nestled in the pale shreds of bark, like eggs in a scraped hollow. The kindling begins to smoke almost immediately, thin white threads rising from the places where the bark touches the embers, and you lean closer and blow softly, a long, steady breath that makes the embers brighten and the bark curl and blacken at its edges. The smoke thickens, changes from white to grey, and then a small flame appears, a tongue of yellow so delicate it seems barely alive, flickering and shrinking, and then growing again as you blow once more. The flame catches the twigs, and the twigs ignite with a soft crackling sound that is the first voice of the fire, a voice that will speak continuously for the next 8 or 9 days and nights, as the kiln slowly transforms wood into charcoal. You climb down from the platform and step back a few paces, watching the flame grow stronger at the crown of the kiln. The smoke column thickens and rises straight up into the still morning air, a pale grey pillar that ascends through the gap in the canopy and disappears against the lighter grey of the sky. And you note with satisfaction that the column is rising vertically, which means the draw is good and the vents are working as they should. The sound of the fire grows from a crackle to a low, steady roar, the sound of air being pulled through the lower vents and rushing upward through the central core where the kindling-filled cavity acts like a chimney, and you walk around the kiln to check each lower vent in turn, feeling with the back of your hand for the cool inflow of air that tells you the passages are clear. The air is indeed moving, drawn inward by the heat above, and you nod once without knowing you have nodded, and then return to your position a few paces back from the kiln, where you can watch the whole structure at once. The flame at the crown is now a bright, vigorous fire that licks upward from the eye and sends occasional sparks spiraling into the air, and you watch it with the steady, patient attention that will define the coming days. The attention of someone whose job is not to intervene, but simply to observe and to know. The first hour of the burn is always the most active, the time when the fire is finding its way into the stack and the wood is beginning to heat and release its moisture. You can hear the moisture leaving the wood as a hissing sound that underlies the roar of the fire, the sound of sap boiling and water turning to steam and escaping through the upper vents in white puffs that mingle with the grey smoke. The earth covering begins to steam as well, the dampness left from the application days ago now driven outward by the heat inside, and the surface of the kiln darkens slightly where the steam condenses and then dries again in patches that spread and merge like shadows moving across the ground. You walk a slow circuit around the kiln every few minutes, pausing at each vent to listen and to smell, checking that the smoke emerging from the upper holes is the right color, a pale grey that indicates clean dry wood heating evenly, not the dark, acrid smoke that would signal wet wood or poor airflow. The smell of the burn is already beginning to establish itself in the clearing, the sweet, sharp scent of hot wood and the earthier smell of the heated soil crust, and you breathe it in deeply without thinking, the way a sailor breathes the salt air of the sea. As the first hour passes into the second, the fire at the crown begins to settle, the bright flame shrinking back into the eye, until what remains is not a fire, but a deep, intense glow that pulses orange and red at the center of the top vent. This is the sign you have been waiting for, the indication that the fire has taken hold properly in the core and no longer needs the open crown to draw air, and you climb back onto the log platform with a turf plug in your hand. The heat coming from the eye is considerable now, a wave of hot air that makes you turn your face aside as you approach, and you use the long iron tongs to place the turf plug over the eye, pressing it down firmly with the flat of the tong blade until it seats in the raised lip you formed around the opening days ago. The plug closes the eye almost completely, but you leave a small gap at one edge, a crescent of open space no wider than your finger, because the fire still needs some outlet while it transitions from the bright burn of kindling to the slow, deep smolder of true charcoal making. The smoke that had been rising in a column from the crown now finds its way to the upper vents, and you see thin grey streams emerging from 4 points around the upper dome, each one a small, steady plume that rises a few feet and then dissipates into the air. The kiln is now breathing through its proper channels, and the long watching has begun. You spend the rest of the morning in the clearing, never far from the kiln, your attention divided between the structure and the small tasks that you have brought to occupy your hands, while your mind monitors the burn. You sit on the log seat with a length of cord and a bundle of hazel withies, weaving a new basket to replace one that has begun to fray at the rim. And the work is simple enough that it does not distract you from the kiln, but absorbing enough that the hours do not drag. Every quarter hour or so, you rise and walk around the kiln, pausing at each lower vent to feel the inflow of air with the back of your hand, pausing at each upper vent to check the color and thickness of the smoke. The smoke tells you everything you need to know about what is happening inside. If it is thin and blue-gray, the burn is progressing well and the wood is carbonizing slowly from the center outward. If it becomes thick and white, the wood is still releasing moisture and the heat needs to be increased by opening the lower vents slightly. If it becomes dark and acrid, something is wrong. Perhaps a pocket of wet wood that is steaming rather than burning, and you would need to adjust the vents to draw more air through that section. So far, the smoke is thin and pale and regular, and you make no adjustments because none are needed. The forest around the clearing continues its own quiet life as you watch the kiln, and you notice without really noticing the way the light changes as the thin grey clouds shift and thin and thicken again overhead. A grey squirrel comes to investigate the clearing, bounding across the open ground in a series of arcs, and then freezing when it notices you sitting on the log seat, its tail flicking nervously as it assesses the risk you pose. You remain still, and after a moment the squirrel decides you are part of the landscape and continues its journey, skirting wide around the warm kiln mound and disappearing into the beeches on the far side. Later, a pair of wood pigeons settle in the canopy above and begin their soft, repetitive cooing, a sound so familiar and so constant that it fades from your awareness almost as soon as it begins, merging with the low hiss of the kiln and the rustle of leaves into a single fabric of background noise that is the sound of the forest at peace. The morning passes into afternoon, and you eat the second half of yesterday's oatcake while walking your circuit around the kiln, your jaw working slowly and your eyes moving across the grey surface of the dome, checking, always checking, though there is nothing wrong, and you do not expect there to be anything wrong, because you have done this so many times and the process is as predictable as the turning of the seasons. By late afternoon, the smoke from the upper vents has thinned to a faint haze that is barely visible against the grey sky, and you know that the kiln has entered the steady phase of its burn, the long, slow smoulder that will continue for days without much change. The lower vents are drawing air steadily, and you can feel the warmth of the kiln now when you stand close to it, a radiant heat that comes through the earth crust and warms your face and hands when you pause at the vents to check the airflow. The surface of the dome is warm to the touch now, not hot, but definitely alive, and in places where the earth is thinnest you can feel the heat more strongly, a reminder that the fire inside is real and hungry and must be watched. You make a small adjustment to one of the lower vents on the north side, opening it by wriggling a finger into the hole and loosening the earth slightly to increase the airflow, because you noticed that the smoke from the nearest upper vent was a little thinner than from the others, and you want the burn to be even all around. The adjustment is tiny, almost nothing, but it is the kind of detail that makes the difference between good charcoal and poor, and you make it with the same matter-of-fact care that you give to every other aspect of the craft. The daylight begins its slow retreat, the grey of the sky deepening into a darker shade that is not yet twilight but is no longer full afternoon. And you gather your basket weaving materials and set them aside under the lean-to for tomorrow. You will sleep here tonight beside the kiln, because the early stages of the burn are the most critical, and you need to be close enough to wake if the sound of the fire changes or the smell of the smoke shifts in a way that signals trouble. You have a canvas sheet folded under the lean-to, and you spread it on the ground a few paces from the kiln, far enough to be safe from any sparks, but close enough that the warmth of the dome will keep the worst of the night chill away. You also have a thick woolen blanket that you brought from the hut this morning, and you arrange it on the canvas with the care of someone making a bed that will be slept in many times over the coming nights. The robin appears again, perhaps the same robin, or perhaps one of its relatives, and it perches on the edge of the kiln where the earth crust meets the ground, tilting its head at you as if asking why you are settling in for the night when you usually leave the clearing before dark. You do not answer, of course, but you feel a small sense of companionship anyway. The presence of another living creature sharing the clearing with you and the kiln and the slowly darkening sky. The night comes on gradually, the way it always does in the forest, the shadows under the trees deepening into blackness, while the open space of the clearing holds on to the last of the grey light a little longer. The kiln becomes more visible as the darkness gathers, not because it is bright, but because the vents show a faint, dull orange glow when you look at them directly, the color of embers seen through a crack in a hearth door. You walk around the kiln one final time before settling onto your canvas bed, checking each vent and finding everything as it should be, the lower ones drawing cool air, the upper ones emitting thin smoke that is now almost invisible in the dusk, and the warmth of the dome a constant, reassuring presence that you can feel even from several feet away. You wrap the blanket around yourself and lie down on the canvas with your head pillowed on a rolled-up sack, and you watch the kiln in the darkness, the faint glow at the vents pulsing almost imperceptibly, like the breathing of a sleeping animal. The stars are not visible tonight because of the cloud cover, but the darkness is not total because the vents provide just enough light to make out the curve of the dome against the darker mass of the trees. The fire inside the kiln is a small, contained world of heat and transformation, and you listen to its sounds as you drift toward sleep, the low hiss of wood turning to charcoal, the occasional creak of a pole settling as it shrinks in the heat, the soft rush of air being drawn through the lower vents, and the gentle crackle that is the voice of the fire speaking to itself in the darkness. You will wake several times during the night to walk around the kiln and check its breathing, but for now you let your eyes close and your body sink into the canvas, and you rest in the warmth of the kiln. The charcoal burner asleep beside his work, the forest standing guard around you both. The first night with the kiln passes in a rhythm that is not quite sleep and not quite waking, but something between the two, a state of restful awareness in which you listen to the sounds of the burn even as your body lies still under the woolen blanket. You rise 3 times during the darkness, each time without fully emerging from the drowsiness that wraps around you like a second blanket, and you walk around the kiln with a small oil lantern held low, its flame barely brighter than the dull orange glow that shows at the edges of the vents. The first check, sometime deep in the night when the forest is at its most silent, you find everything in order. The lower vents drawing steadily, the upper vents releasing a thin haze of smoke that smells clean and dry, the surface of the dome warm to the touch, but not hot enough to be alarming. You press your palm flat against the earth crust on the north side, and feel the heat pulsing faintly beneath. A steady, deep warmth like the flank of a living animal, and you note without concern that the north side is slightly cooler than the south, which is normal at this stage because the prevailing air currents always favor one side in the early hours. You adjust nothing, only walk the full circuit twice to be sure, and then you return to your canvas bed and pull the blanket up to your chin and let your eyes close while the kiln breathes on beside you. The second rising comes in the deep stillness that precedes the first hint of dawn, the hour when even the owls have fallen silent and the forest holds its breath in anticipation of the day. This time, you notice that the smoke from the upper vents has thinned almost to nothing, just the faintest shimmer of heat in the air above each hole, and you know that the burn has moved from its early, vigorous phase into the long, steady smolder that will characterize most of its life. The lower vents are still drawing air, and when you crouch beside one and hold the lantern close, you can see the fine ash that has begun to accumulate on the inner edges of the hole, a pale grey dust that is the first sign of the wood breaking down inside. You use a small twig to clean this ash away from one vent where it has built up enough to narrow the opening, a tiny maintenance that takes only a moment, and then you walk the full circuit and find everything else as it should be. Back on your canvas, you lie on your side facing the kiln and watch the faint glow at the vents pulse slowly in the darkness, a light so dim it is almost not there at all, and you drift back into the shallow rest that is the charcoal burner's special skill, the ability to sleep while remaining tethered to awareness by a thread of attention that never quite lets go. The third rising comes just as the sky above the clearing begins to change from black to deep blue. The first sign of the morning that is still an hour away. This time you do not use the lantern because there is just enough light to make out the shape of the kiln against the trees, and you walk around it with your hands doing the checking, your fingers feeling the temperature of the earth crust at different points, your palms testing the airflow at each lower vent. The dome is warmer now than it was at midnight, the heat from the core having slowly penetrated outward through the wood, and the earth covering until the whole structure radiates a gentle, steady warmth that you can feel from a pace away. The north side has caught up with the south, the temperature now even all around, and you nod in the darkness with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose work is proceeding exactly as it should. You unplug one of the lower vents on the west side, where the airflow feels slightly sluggish, using the iron rod to clear the tunnel of a small blockage of crumbled earth. And then you replace the turf plug loosely, so that the vent is open just the right amount. These small adjustments are the essence of kiln tending, a continuous conversation between the burner and the fire in which the fire speaks through smoke and heat, and the burner answers with earth and air, and you have been fluent in this language for so long that you no longer think about the grammar of it, only speak it as naturally as breathing. The day comes fully while you are sitting on the log seat with the blanket still wrapped around your shoulders, the grey light returning to the clearing and bringing with it the first bird calls of the morning. The robin is back, or perhaps it never left, and it sings a few tentative notes from the low beech branch before flying down to the ground near the kiln, where the warmth has driven a few small insects up from the soil. You watch the bird hop about, pecking at the dark earth, and you feel a kinship with it that you could not put into words. The shared experience of being awake and at work while the rest of the world still sleeps. The kiln is producing almost no visible smoke now, just a faint heat haze above each upper vent that distorts the air slightly like the shimmer over a hot rock in summer, and this tells you that the wood inside has fully dried and is now carbonizing properly, the volatile compounds driven off and the pure carbon beginning to form in the heart of each pole. The smell of the burn has changed as well, from the sharp, sweet smell of green wood heating to a cleaner, drier smell that is almost like the scent of autumn leaves burning, but fainter and more distant. A smell that you have to concentrate to notice at all, now that you have to concentrate to notice at all, now that you have been sitting in it for hours. The morning passes in a pattern that will become the rhythm of all the days to come until the burn is finished. A slow circuit of the kiln every half hour or so, a check of each vent with hand and eye, a brief pause to listen to the sounds inside the mound, and then a return to the log seat where the basket weaving or the billhook sharpening or the mending of a torn sleeve occupies your hands while your mind stays tuned to the kiln like an instrument left lying on a table that vibrates faintly whenever a note is struck nearby and an entalpal the basket you began yesterday is taking shape. The hazel withies woven in a simple spiral that grows upward from a flat base, and you work on it with the same patient, unhurried attention that you give to the kiln, each withy bent and tucked and woven under and over with a rhythm that your hands remember from 1,000 previous baskets. The work is useful and satisfying but not demanding, and it leaves your mind free to wander across the surface of the morning while your deeper attention remains anchored to the dome of earth and the fire hidden inside it. Around mid-morning, you notice a change in the sound of the burn, a subtle shift in the low hiss that has been the background music of the clearing since yesterday. The hiss has become slightly louder on the east side, a more insistent rush of air that suggests a small channel has opened inside the stack where the wood has shrunk and left a gap that is drawing more air than it should. You walk around to the east side and crouch beside the lower vent there, holding your hand close to the opening and feeling the airflow that is indeed stronger than on the other sides. Cool air rushing inward with a force that you can feel against your palm. Too much air in one place will make that part of the kiln burn faster and hotter, producing ash instead of charcoal, and so you take the turf plug from beside the vent and push it partway into the hole, reducing the opening by half. The sound of the airflow drops immediately, settling back into the same quiet note as the other vents, and you listen for a long moment to be sure the adjustment is right before standing up and brushing the earth from your knees. These small interventions are the only drama the kiln ever provides. And even they are not really drama, but just the ordinary adjustments of the process that is as natural and predictable as the weather. A process that requires only watchfulness and patience, and the willingness to respond to small changes with small actions. The afternoon brings a light rain, a fine drizzle that begins so gently you do not notice it at first, only becoming aware when you look up from your weaving and see that the surface of the kiln has darkened slightly where the moisture is settling on the warm earth. The rain is not heavy enough to be a concern, and in fact it can be helpful at this stage, because the added moisture on the outside of the dome helps to seal any tiny cracks that might have formed as the earth dried in the heat. But you still check the upper vents to make sure no water is running into them and pooling inside the stack. The vents are angled outward and slightly downward, as you made them, and the rain beads on the rim of each hole without entering. So you return to the log seat, but move it closer to the oak trunk where the canopy is thickest, and the drizzle reaches the ground only as a fine mist that barely wets the blanket around your shoulders. The robin has retreated to a sheltered spot somewhere in the undergrowth, and the grey squirrel has not appeared at all today, sensible enough to stay in its dray while the weather is damp. You are alone in the clearing with the kiln and the rain and the quiet drip of water from the beech leaves, and the loneliness that might press on another person in such circumstances is something you have never felt, because the forest has always been company enough and the kiln more than enough, a task and a companion and a reason all in one. The hours of the afternoon stretch out in the same gentle rhythm, the circuits of the kiln continuing at their regular intervals, the basket growing slowly taller in your hands, the light rain falling and then stopping and then falling again in a pattern that seems to have no pattern at times to have no pattern at all. You eat a small piece of cheese and another oatcake while sitting on the log, and you drink from the leather bottle that is now half empty and will need refilling at the spring before nightfall. The kiln continues its quiet breathing, the vents glowing faintly orange when you look directly into them, the earth crust warm and dry now that the rain has stopped, the whole structure settled into its work like a good horse walking a familiar road. You think, without any urgency, about the days ahead. The burn will need another 3 or 4 days of this steady watching, maybe 5 if the wood was greener than you thought, and then a day of sealing all the vents completely to smother the fire, and then 2 or 3 days of cooling before you can open the mound and rake out the charcoal. These numbers are not fixed but fluid, depending on the weather and the wood and the 1,000 small variables that no burner can control, but every burner must accommodate, and you hold them in your mind not as a schedule but as a sense of the shape of the coming week, the way you might hold a stone in your hand and feel its weight without needing to name it. Evening comes with a slow darkening of the grey sky into a deeper grey, the transition so gradual that you cannot say when the afternoon became evening, only that at some point you look up from your weaving and realize that the light has changed and the birds have begun their evening chorus, a last burst of song before the silence of the night. The robin is back, singing from a high branch now, and the song thrush has joined it with its repeated phrases, each one a small melodic fragment that it sings 3 times before moving on to the next. You set aside the basket, which is now nearly finished, the rim only needing a final binding of split willow, and you walk around the kiln for what will be the first of the evening checks. The smoke is still almost invisible, just a faint blue haze at one of the upper vents that suggests a pocket of resinous wood is burning a little hotter than the rest. Nothing to worry about, only something to note and watch. The lower vents are all drawing evenly, the turf plugs still in their adjusted positions from the morning, and the warmth of the dome is as steady as it has been all day. A heat that is felt more than measured, a presence in the clearing that you have grown so used to you would notice its absence more than you notice its presence. You refill the leather bottle at the spring, on the way back to the clearing, the water cold and clear, and tasting faintly of the minerals in the rock it flows over, and you drink deeply before hanging the bottle on its peg under the lean-to. The canvas sheet from last night is still spread on the ground, and you shake it out to remove any leaves or insects that have settled on it during the day. Then you fold the blanket neatly at its foot, ready for the night ahead. You will sleep here again tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night until the burn is done. Because the kiln does not recognize the difference between day and night, and the watchful presence of the burner is the only thing that stands between a good yield of charcoal and a pile of ash. This responsibility does not feel heavy to you. It is simply the way things are, the shape of your life, the duty that you accepted when you learned the craft from the old burner who taught you and who had learned it from someone before him. A chain of knowledge and care that stretches back into a past so distant, no one remembers its beginning. The night settles over the clearing like a slow tide, filling the spaces between the trees with darkness and pushing the last of the grey light up into the sky, where it lingers for a while above the canopy before fading entirely. The kiln becomes more visible as the darkness deepens, not because it is bright, but because the faint orange glow at the vents now stands out against the blackness, a constellation of small warm lights arranged around the dome like the windows of a tiny earth-covered city. You lie on the canvas with a blanket pulled up to your chest and your hands folded behind your head, and you watch the vents pulse softly in the dark, each one a small steady point of light that flickers only when a slight shift of air inside the mound causes the fire to brighten for a moment. The sounds of the kiln are the sounds you will fall asleep to, the low hiss of the smolder, the occasional settling creak of a log shifting as it loses mass, the soft rush of air drawn through the lower vents, and beneath all of these the deep, almost subaudible hum of the fire itself, a sound that is more a feeling than a sound, a vibration in the ground and in the air and in your own bones that tells you the work is proceeding and all is well. The forest around the clearing is silent now, the birds long since roosted, and the small mammals going about their nocturnal business with a quietness that does not disturb the peace, and you feel yourself held in the great dark palm of the night, a small warm presence beside the larger, warmer presence of the kiln, both of you breathing together in the ancient rhythm that has governed this clearing for longer than anyone can remember, and will continue to govern it long after you are gone. Your eyes close, and your thoughts slow, and the last thing you are aware of before sleep takes you is the faint orange glow of the vents, pulsing gently in the darkness like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The morning arrives without sound or signal, the grey light seeping into the clearing so gradually that you cannot mark the exact moment when the darkness ended and the day began. Only that at some point you open your eyes and find the world no longer black, but a soft, muted grey that makes the kiln dome appear like a low hill against the trees. You lie still for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the burn that have become as familiar as your own breathing, the same low hiss and the same occasional creak and the same faint rush of air through the lower vents that has been the music of the night. Your body is slightly stiff from sleeping on the canvas, a pleasant stiffness that reminds you of work done and rest earned, and you stretch your arms above your head and then your legs, pointing your toes toward the kiln and feeling the muscles loosen. The blanket is damp on the outside from the night mist, but warm on the inside where your body has been, and you fold it back carefully, letting the moisture evaporate while you rise and walk your first circuit of the day. The kiln is in the same steady state you left it at your last check in the deep night, the upper vents emitting nothing but a faint shimmer of heat that you can barely see except when you look at the exact angle against the sky. The lower vents drawing air with a cool, even pull that tells you the internal channels are still open and the fire is still burning in its slow, deliberate way. The earth crust is warm under your palm, the temperature exact to what you expect, and you find nothing that needs attention, so you complete your circuit and then walk to the spring to splash water on your face and refill the leather bottle. The path to the spring is damp with dew that soaks into the leather of your shoes and darkens the hem of your tunic, and you walk through a patch of ferns that brush against your legs and leave trails of moisture on the coarse wool. At the spring the water flows from the bank with the same gentle trickle it has always had. The sound like a very quiet conversation between the earth and the air, and you kneel and cup your hands and drink until the cold settles in your stomach, like a small, clean stone. The forest is waking around you as you walk back to the clearing, the birds beginning their morning calls one by one, in a sequence that never changes. First the robin with its clear, questioning notes, then the wren from somewhere deep in a hazel thicket, with a burst of song so loud and complicated, for such a tiny bird, that it always seems like a miracle. Then the blackbird, with its fluting melody, that rises and falls like the shape of the hills beyond the forest. You pause on the path to listen, not because you have made a decision to pause, but because your feet have stopped moving without your instruction, and you stand in the dappled grey light with the water bottle dangling from your fingers and let the bird song wash over you like a second invisible weather. The wren is particularly insistent this morning. It sung a rapid cascade of trills and whistles that goes on for so long. You wonder how the bird draws breath, and then it stops abruptly as if someone has closed a door, leaving only the blackbird and the distant soft cooing of a wood pigeon somewhere deeper in the wood pigeon, somewhere deeper in the wood. Back in the clearing you eat a small piece of hard cheese and the last of yesterday's oatcake, sitting on the log seat with your back against the oak and your eyes on the kiln while you chew. The cheese is sharp and slightly crumbly, and you eat it slowly, letting each small piece dissolve on your tongue before you swallow. The kiln continues its quiet breathing, and you let your attention rest on it lightly, the way you might rest a hand on a gate, without needing to push it open. The morning clouds are thin and high, moving slowly from west to east in a drift that is almost imperceptible, and occasionally a patch of brighter light breaks through and travels across the clearing, illuminating the dome of the kiln and making the earth's surface look lighter and warmer before the shadow returns. You watch these patches of light come and go without any particular thought, just registering them the way you register the flight of a bird or the rustle of leaves as part of the continuous fabric of the day. After a while, a brief shower passes over the clearing, a light rain that begins so gently you do not notice until a drop lands on the back of your hand and you look up to see the air full of fine, slanting lines of grey. The rain is not heavy enough to force you under shelter, and you stay on the log seat and feel the drops cool on your skin and see them darken the surface of the kiln in tiny, spreading circles that merge together until the whole dome is a shade darker. The shower lasts only a few minutes, then it moves on, and the sky lightens again, the clouds thinning enough to let a weak, watery sun shine through and make the wet ferns at the edge of the clearing glitter with droplets. You rise and walk to the kiln to check that no water has entered the vents, but the angle of the holes has done its work, and the interiors are dry, so you return to your seat and pick up the billhook that you had been meaning to sharpen since yesterday. The whetstone is a smooth, dark grey piece of river rock that you keep in a small leather pouch under the lean-to, and you set it on your knee and begin to work the curved blade across it with long, even strokes that make a soft singing sound, a high, thin note that blends with the birdsong and the hiss of the kiln. As you sharpen the blade, holding it at the precise angle that you learned so long ago you cannot remember learning it, you become aware of a very distant sound that might be the ringing of a hammer from the ironworks beyond the forest. The sound is so faint that you are not entirely sure you are hearing it at all. It might be the echo of a woodpecker, or the creak of a branch in the wind, or simply your imagination filling the silence with something familiar. You pause in your sharpening and listen more carefully, the whetstone held still against the blade, and for a moment the sound comes again, a tiny metallic note that is gone almost as soon as you register it. The ironworks have been running less often since the war began, you have heard, because the demand for iron has shifted and the transport routes are disrupted. But some of the furnaces still operate when they have enough charcoal and enough ore and enough men to work the bellows. You've not been to the ironworks yourself for several weeks, and the thought of walking there with a load of charcoal is something you note and then set aside, a consideration for another day when the kiln is opened and the charcoal sacked and the tracks are dry enough for the cart you do not use but might borrow from a neighbour if the load is large enough. The sharpening continues, the whetstone moving back and forth along the curved edge of the billhook, and you test the sharpness occasionally by running your thumb lightly across the blade, feeling the tiny burr of metal that tells you the edge is keen. When the blade is as sharp as you want it, you wipe it clean with a rag and slide it back into the leather sheath at your belt. Then you stretch your arms and walk another circuit around the kiln. The dome is drying now after the rain, the darker patches fading as the moisture evaporates in the thin sun, and you note without concern that a small crack has appeared on the northwest side where the earth crust has contracted as it dried. The crack is only as wide as a blade of grass and not deep enough to affect the burn, but you make a mental note to fill it later with a pinch of damp earth from the bank, a task so small it barely registers as a task at all. The upper vents are still emitting their faint heat haze, the lower vents still drawing air with a steady, quiet flow, and you can tell from the temperature of the dome at different points that the fire is moving evenly through the wood, the center of the stack carbonizing first, and the transformation spreading slowly outward toward the edges. You spend the middle of the day in the same slow rhythm that has filled all the days of the burn so far, a rhythm that is not so much a schedule as a way of being, a state of quiet attention that rises and falls like the forest's own breathing. You finish the basket you have been weaving for the past 2 days, binding the rim with a strip of split willow that you soak in the spring to make it flexible, and you set the finished basket beside the lean-to where it will be useful for carrying small loads of charcoal dust or kindling. You mend a small tear in the sleeve of your spare tunic, a task you have been putting off for weeks, and you sew with a needle made of bone and thread made of twisted flax, your stitches small and even and almost invisible against the brown wool. You walk to the edge of the clearing and gather a handful of wild garlic leaves that are growing among the roots of an old hornbeam, and you chew them slowly, enjoying the sharp green taste that cleans your mouth and reminds you of springs from long ago when you were a boy and first learned which plants were good to eat and which were not. In the afternoon, the clouds thicken again and the weak sun disappears, leaving the clearing in a grey light that is soft and even, the kind of light that makes colours look deeper and shadows disappear entirely. The kiln continues its quiet work, and you sit on the log seat with your hands resting on your knees and your eyes half closed, not sleeping but not fully awake either, just existing in the grey afternoon like the trees and the stones and the dome of earth that is slowly transforming wood into charcoal. The robin comes and perches on the handle of the shovel that you left leaning against the oak, and it looks at you with one bright eye and then flies away again, its red breast a flash of color in the muted light. A grey squirrel passes through the clearing, not the same one from yesterday perhaps, but its twin, and it pauses at the base of the kiln where the earth is warm and digs for a moment with its front paws before moving on into the undergrowth. These small visitations are the only company you have, and they are company enough. The forest day around you continues in its slow, ancient pattern, and you are part of it just as the trees are part of it, and the birds are part of it, and the kiln with its hidden fire is part of it. You feel the peace of the clearing settle into your bones, a peace that is not the absence of noise or movement, but the presence of a deep and enduring order. The order of the seasons turning, and the coppice regrowing and the charcoal forming in the dark heart of the mound. The faint, metallic ringing from the direction of the ironworks does not come again, and if you strain your ears you cannot hear anything beyond the forest at all. No armies marching, no messengers riding, no news of a kingdom without its king. There is only the soft hiss of the kiln, the drip of rainwater from the tips of the ferns, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze that has begun to stir the canopy, and the slow, steady turning of the earth that will soon carry the afternoon into evening and the evening into night. The same cycle that has turned here for all the years of your life, and for all the years before your life, and for all the years that will come after. When the king is forgotten, and the war is forgotten, and the charcoal you are making has burned in the ferns, you sit in the grey light and watch the kiln breathe, and you are content in a way that has no name and needs no name, content as the beeches are content, as the moss is content, as the earth itself is content under the slow drift of the clouds. The day fades toward evening, and you rise to make your final checks before the night, the leather bottle in your hand and the blanket waiting on the canvas, while the forest holds you in its quiet, patient palm and the kiln glows faintly at its vents, ready for another night of slow smolder and steady watchfulness. The darkness on this night is deeper than the nights that came before it, a darkness that feels almost thick as you move through the clearing with the lantern unlit, because you have walked this ground so many times that your feet know every dip and every root and every stone without the need for sight. The clouds that covered the sky all day have finally broken apart after sunset, retreating to the east in long, ragged bands that left the stars exposed and sharp, and without the cloud blanket to hold the warmth, the air has grown colder than it has been all week. You feel the cold on your cheeks and on the tips of your ears, and you pull the woolen blanket tighter around your shoulders as you walk your evening circuit, the familiar path around the kiln that you have walked so many times now, that you could do it in your deepest sleep. The kiln itself is different tonight, transformed by the darkness into something that seems less like a mound of earth and more like a living thing, its surface broken by tiny cracks that you did not see during the daylight hours, hairline fissures in the earth crust that have opened as the dome dried and contracted. And through these cracks comes a dull orange glow that pulses very faintly, very slowly, like the breathing of some large and patient animal that has curled up in the center of the clearing to rest. You stop at the north side of the kiln, where a particularly fine crack traces a jagged line from one of the lower vents up toward the curve of the dome, and you crouch down to look at it more closely. The light that escapes through this crack is the color of embers at the very end of a fire, a deep, somber orange that is almost red, and as you watch it dims slightly and then brightens again in a rhythm that matches the slow draw of air through the vents. The heat coming from the crack is gentle but definite, a warm breath against your face that smells of dry wood and hot earth and something else, something purer, the smell of carbon being born in the dark. You place your palm flat on the earth crust beside the crack, not to test the temperature, but simply to feel the life of the kiln, the steady warmth that has been your companion for days now, and that will continue to be your companion for several days more. The surface is rough and grainy under your hand, and you can feel the faint vibration of the fire inside, a tremor so slight that it might be imagination, but is probably real. The movement of air and heat through the channels that you built with your careful placement of every pole and every handful of earth. The rest of the clearing is in complete darkness except for these thin lines of orange light that trace across the surface of the kiln. And you find that you do not need the lantern at all to see the dome. It is illuminated from within, a low, rounded shape picked out in a web of faintly glowing cracks that make it look like a map of some unknown country or the shell of a strange egg that holds a secret fire at its center. You walk slowly around the full circumference, pausing at each vent to feel the airflow and check that the turf plugs are still in their correct positions, and the vents themselves blow more brightly than the cracks, each one a small circle of deeper orange that looks like an eye watching you in the dark, though the watching is not hostile or even curious, but simply present, the way the stars are present or the way the trees are present, a steady, silent witness. The lower vents on the south side are drawing harder than the others, a fact you note by the feel of the cool air moving past your fingers, and you make a tiny adjustment by pushing the turf plug a fraction deeper, reducing the opening by no more than the thickness of a twig, a change so small that no one but you would ever know it had been made. The sound of the airflow drops slightly, settles into the same quiet note as the other vents, and you nod once in the darkness and continue your circuit. When the check is complete and you are satisfied that the kiln is breathing evenly, you return to the canvas sheet that is spread on the ground a few paces from the warm mound, the same canvas you have slept on for 3 nights now, and you arrange the blanket over yourself with the care of someone settling into a familiar bed. The canvas is slightly damp from the evening mist, but the dampness is not unpleasant, only cool against your back when you first lie down, and you know that your body heat will soon warm it through. You lie on your side facing the kiln, your head pillowed on the rolled-up sack that has taken on the shape of your head over the past nights and now fits you perfectly. And you pull the blanket up to your chin and let your eyes rest on the glowing cracks that trace across the dome like the paths of slow lightning frozen in earth. The cold air is sharp against your face, but the rest of your body is warm under the blanket, and the contrast is pleasant in a way that reminds you of winters long ago when you were a boy and slept in a loft under the thatch while the frost made patterns on the inside of the window glass. You have no window here, no thatch, no glass, only the open sky and the dark shapes of the beeches and the glowing dome of the kiln, but you are as comfortable as you have ever been anywhere, as comfortable as anyone could be who is exactly where they are supposed to be and doing exactly what they are supposed to do. The sounds of the kiln at night are different from the sounds it makes during the day, or perhaps the sounds are the same, but you hear them differently because your eyes are closed and the rest of the world is silent. There is the low, steady hiss that has been the background music of the burn since the first hour after lighting, a sound that is not really a hiss, but something between a hiss and a sigh, the sound of air moving through hot wood and escaping through the upper vents. There is the occasional creak that comes from deep inside the mound, the sound of a log shifting as it loses mass and settles into a new position. A sound that is always single and never repeated immediately, so that you listen for the next one and are never quite sure when it will come. There is the softer, more continuous sound of the lower vents drawing air, a whisper that varies slightly as the breeze shifts in the clearing, growing louder for a moment when a gust stirs the beech leaves and then fading back to its quiet baseline. And beneath all of these, there is the deep, almost subaudible thrum of the fire itself, a sound that is more a feeling in the ground than a sound in the air, a vibration that travels through the earth and into your body where you lie on the canvas, so that you seem to be not just listening to the kiln, but connected to it, part of its slow process of transformation. The forest beyond the clearing is not entirely silent either, and the night sounds drift to you in snatches between the breaths of the kiln. A tawny owl calls from somewhere deep in the oaks, a long, wavering hoot that rises slightly at the end like a question that does not expect an answer, and after a pause of perhaps a minute, the call comes again from a different direction, the owl having moved to a new perch or a second owl having taken up the conversation. You listen to the owl calls with the detached attention of someone who has heard them 1,000 times, and will hear them 1,000 times more, the sound as familiar as the creak of the kiln or the rustle of the blanket when you shift your position. A fox barks once, a sharp high sound that cuts through the night and then is gone, leaving a silence that seems deeper than before. Small creatures move in the undergrowth near the edge of the clearing, making rustling sounds that are too faint to identify, the sounds of voles or shrews or beetles going about their nocturnal business with an urgency that you do not share. You lie still and let these sounds wash over you, not thinking about them, not naming them, just hearing them as part of the great, quiet tapestry of the night. The stars above the clearing are as bright as you have seen them in many months, the absence of the moon and the clarity of the air after the rain combining to make the sky look deeper and blacker and the stars look closer and sharper. When you open your eyes and look up past the dark shapes of the beech branches, you can see the great band of the Milky Way stretching from one side of the clearing to the other, a river of pale light made of countless individual stars that are too many and too distant to see separately, their combined glow a faint, dusty white that seems to have been scattered across the black slate of the sky like fine ash from an enormous fire. You think, without any urgency, about the charcoal dust that you mix with the covering earth, the same fine black powder that is even now forming inside the kiln as the wood gives up its volatile parts and becomes pure carbon. And you imagine that the Milky Way is made of the same substance, the ash of some vast and ancient burn that happened long before the forest existed, long before the earth itself existed, a fire so old that no one was there to tend it, and no one was there to watch its glow. The thought is not a thought so much as an image that passes through your mind and then fades, leaving no trace, and you return your attention to the nearer, warmer glow of the kiln, the orange cracks still pulsing faintly in the dark. The slight crackling sound that sometimes comes from the upper vents has stopped now, the last of the resinous wood having been consumed earlier in the day, and what remains is the pure, steady smolder of wood that is almost entirely converted to charcoal, the hottest and quietest phase of the burn. You know from the color of the glow at the cracks, a deep orange that is just beginning to show hints of a paler yellow at its very center, that the core of the stack is approaching the ideal temperature and the charcoal there is nearly ready, though the outer layers will need several more days of slow heat before they are fully transformed. This knowledge is not a matter of conscious calculation, but of long familiarity, the way you know that bread is done by its smell, or that rain is coming by the feel of the wind, and you register it without any particular emotion, simply as a fact that will determine your actions over the coming days. You will need to close the lower vents a little more tomorrow to reduce the airflow and slow the burn even further, allowing the outer wood to catch up with the core without overheating the center and turning the finished charcoal to ash. This adjustment will be tiny, almost imperceptible, a matter of nudging each turf plug inward by the thickness of a finger, and it will be the last adjustment you make before the final sealing that will smother the fire entirely and begin the cooling phase. The owl calls again, closer this time, and you turn your head on the rolled sack to look toward the sound, but see only the dark mass of the beeches and the darker gaps between them. The owl is a tawny owl, you are almost certain, It's called the classic long hoot, followed by a shorter, fainter note that echoes through the trees in a way that makes it difficult to tell exactly where the bird is perched. You have seen tawny owls in this part of the forest before. Their round faces and dark eyes and mottled brown feathers that make them almost invisible against the bark of the oaks. But you have never seen one in the clearing itself, because the open space offers no cover, and the owls prefer the deep shadows between the trunks. The call comes again, a series of hoots that sound almost like words spoken in a language you do not understand, and then it stops, and the silence that follows is so complete that you can hear, very faintly, the sound of a distant stream running over stones somewhere beyond the coppice. The stream is the same one that feeds your spring, and its sound is a constant presence in the forest if you listen carefully enough, a low, musical note beneath all the other sounds. The voice of the water that has been running through this valley since long before the first trees grew, and will continue running long after the last trees have fallen. The warmth from the kiln reaches you where you lie on the canvas, not as a strong heat, but as a gentle radiation that takes the edge off the cold and makes the air around you feel almost temperate, despite the chill of the open sky above. The side of your body that faces the kiln is noticeably warmer than the side that faces away, and you shift slightly under the blanket so that your back is toward the dome, letting the warmth spread across your shoulders and down your spine. The sensation is deeply comforting, the warmth of a fire that you cannot see but can feel. The presence of the kiln as real and as reassuring as the presence of another person might be in a different kind of life. You have spent so many nights alone in this forest over so many years that the solitude has become not a lack of company, but a form of company itself. The company of the trees and the stars and the kiln and the small creatures that move in the dark, and you would not trade it for the busiest hearth or the fullest table, because it has become part of who you are, woven into the fabric of your days and nights, as tightly as the threads of the blanket are woven together. Time passes, though you do not measure it, and the stars wheel slowly overhead in their silent, ancient dance. The constellation that the old burner called the charcoal sack, a dark patch in the Milky Way that looks like a hole in the sky, has moved from its position above the eastern beaches to a point almost directly overhead, and you know from its movement that several hours have passed since you lay down. Though it feels like no time at all, you rise once to make a check of the kiln, pushing back the blanket and walking the circuit with bare feet that feel the cold earth and the warm spots near the vents in alternating steps. Everything is as it should be, the glow steady, the airflow even, the sounds unchanged, and you return to the canvas and lie down again without having woken fully, your body going through the motions of the check while your mind remains suspended in the dreamlike state between sleep and waking. The owl is silent now, and the fox has not barked again, and even the small rustlings in the undergrowth have ceased, leaving only the hiss of the kiln and the distant, almost imagined sound of the stream, and the deep abiding silence of the forest at the very center of the night. Your eyes grow heavy, the weight of the darkness pressing gently on your lids, and you let them close without resistance. The last thing you see before sleep takes you is the pattern of orange cracks on the dome of the kiln, a map of light that will still be there when you wake, still pulsing faintly in its slow, patient rhythm, still transforming wood into charcoal in the dark heart of the mound. The sounds of the smolder blend together into a single continuous note that is not quite music and not quite noise, a sound that your sleeping mind incorporates into dreams that you will not remember when you wake. The cold air settles around you like another blanket, and the stars continue their slow rotation above the clearing, and the owl might call again or might not, and the kiln breathes on through the night, the charcoal burner asleep beside his work, the forest standing guard around them both, while no moon disturbs the deep and peaceful dark. The day comes when the kiln has finished its work, and you know this before you even rise from the canvas, because the sound of the burn has stopped, replaced by a silence that is deeper and more complete than any silence you have heard in the 10 days since the lighting. The hiss that has been your constant companion is gone. The creak of settling logs is gone. The faint rush of air through the vents is gone. And what remains is a stillness so profound that it seems to press gently against your ears like the silence at the bottom of a deep well. You lie still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around you, and then you push back the blanket and stand up into the grey morning that is cool and damp and smells of wet leaves and old wood smoke, and, underneath everything else, the clean, dry scent of finished charcoal that is cooled enough to be safe. The kiln dome is a uniform grey again, the cracks that glowed orange in the darkness now closed and dark, the vents all sealed with their turf plugs pushed firmly home, and the whole structure looks like a small sleeping hill that has always been here and will always be here, patient and silent and still holding its treasure inside. You sealed the last of the vents 2 days ago, after determining by the color of the glow and the sound of the fire that the burn was complete and the charcoal was ready, and since then you have waited for the mound to cool, checking the surface every few hours with your palm and feeling the warmth gradually retreat from the earth crust until it was no warmer than the surrounding ground. The cooling phase is the slowest part of the whole process, slower even than the burn itself, because the earth covering holds the heat inside like a thick blanket, and the charcoal inside is so well insulated that it can remain hot enough to burn for many days after the air supply is cut off. You have been patient during these days of waiting, occupying yourself with small tasks around a clearing in the hut, but now the waiting is over and it is time to open the mound and see what the fire has given you. You begin the opening with the same careful attention that you gave to the covering, working methodically around the base of the dome with the flat wooden shovel to remove the earth crust in sections. The earth is dry now and comes away in large, brittle pieces that crumble to dark powder as they fall, and you pile them to one side, where they will be reused for the next burn. The same earth that has covered a dozen kilns before this one, and will cover a dozen more after. As you work, the smell of finished charcoal grows stronger, a clean, sharp smell that is completely different from the smell of burning wood, almost like the smell of cold ash, but fresher and purer and with a faint undertone of something metallic. The first pieces of charcoal become visible through the gaps in the earth crust, their black surfaces dull in the grey morning light, and you reach in with a gloved hand and pull out a single piece the length of your forearm, a section of what was once a hazel pole and is now pure black carbon, its texture showing the grain of the original wood in fine, delicate lines that trace across its surface like the veins in a leaf. You tap it gently against the side of the shovel, and it rings with a clear musical note, the sound of good charcoal that has been burned at exactly the right temperature for exactly the right time, and you set it aside with the quiet satisfaction of work well done. The raking out takes the rest of the morning, and you work with a long iron rake to carefully pull the charcoal from the collapsed mound, reaching into the dark interior of the dome and drawing out piece after piece of the black, brittle material that is the only product of 10 days of watching and waiting. The charcoal emerges in a variety of sizes, from long, intact lengths that have held their original pole shape to shorter fragments that snapped during the burn to smaller pieces the size of your fist or smaller that will be used for different purposes. And you sort these roughly as you rake, building separate piles on the ground around the kiln floor. The largest and most intact pieces are the most valuable, the ones the iron workers prefer for their furnaces, because they burn hot and steady and do not crumble under the weight of the ore, and you handle these with extra care, lifting them out by hand and laying them in a neat pile on a piece of old canvas. The smaller fragments will be acceptable for smaller forges or for the bloomery that produces the softer iron used for hinges and nails, and the smallest crumbs and dust will be saved and mixed with the next batch of covering earth or used to line the floor of the next kiln, so that nothing is wasted and everything returns to the cycle. By midday, the kiln is empty and the sorting is complete, and you stand back to survey the results of your labor. The piles of charcoal on the ground are larger than you expected, the burn having gone even better than your initial estimate suggested, and you calculate without numbers that you have enough to fill perhaps 20 sacks, maybe 22 if you pack them carefully. The charcoal is of excellent quality, the pieces heavy and hard and ringing when struck. Their surfaces are deep, lustrous black that reflects the grey sky in a way that is almost glossy. You are not proud in the ordinary sense of the word, pride being a feeling you have never cultivated, but you do feel a deep, quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you have done the work as it should be done, and the forest has provided what it should provide, and the fire has transformed what it should provide, and the fire has transformed what it should transform. The whole cycle completing itself as it has completed itself countless times before, and will complete itself countless times again. You spend the afternoon sacking the charcoal, a task that is dusty and repetitive, but not unpleasant, because it brings with it the sense of finishing, of bringing the long process to its proper close. The sacks are made of coarse hemp and have been stored under the lean-to since the last burn, and you shake each one out to remove any spiders or debris before propping it open with a hoop of bent willow. You fill the sacks using a flat wooden scoop, bending and lifting and pouring in a rhythm that your body settles into without thought, and when each sack is full, you tie its neck with a length of twine and drag it to a neat row beside the lean-to. The charcoal dust rises around you as you work, a fine black powder that settles on your clothes and your skin and in your hair until you look almost like a figure made of charcoal yourself, a walking shadow that has emerged from the kiln along with the product it made. You do not mind the dust, have never minded it, because it washes off in the spring and because it is the honest mark of your trade, as much a part of you as the calluses on your hands and the knowledge in your bones. The next morning, you rise early and load 5 sacks of the best charcoal onto the small handcart that lives under a shelter of branches near the track junction where your path meets the wider forest road. The cart is not yours but belongs to no one in particular, having been built long ago by someone whose name is forgotten and maintained by whoever needs it, and its wheels are solid rounds of oak that squeak as they turn and have worn deep grooves in the cart body where the axle rubs. You lift the sacks one by one, grunting slightly with the effort, and arrange them on the cart bed so that their weight is balanced and they will not shift during the journey. The morning is cool, and the sky is the same high, pale grey that has covered the forest for most of the past week, and the track ahead of you is dry and firm after the days without rain, the walking conditions as good as they ever are for the journey to the ironworks. The forest road is wider than the paths that lead to your clearing, wide enough for a horse and cart to pass if two should meet, though two almost never meet because the traffic through this part of the wood is sparse and irregular. The occasional charcoal burner like yourself, or a woodcutter or a carrier taking iron to the river. The road follows the contour of the valley, rising and falling gently as it skirts the larger hills, and it passes through sections of the forest that you know less intimately than your own coppice and clearing, but that are still familiar in their general character. The same beeches and oaks and the same undergrowth of holly and hazel, and the same soft leaf litter on the ground. You walk beside the cart with one hand on the shaft, guiding it around the deeper ruts and the larger stones, and you listen to the sounds of the forest that are slightly different here than they are at home. More bird calls from the open areas where the canopy is thinner, more rustling in the undergrowth from disturbed deer that move away before you can see them. The walk is several miles, and you settle into the pace of it, a steady, ground-covering stride that eats up the distance without hurrying. At a bend in the road where an old yew tree grows with its trunk split into 2 living halves, you pause to rest and drink from the leather bottle. The yew is ancient, far older than any oak in this part of the forest, and its dark, dense foliage casts a deep shade that has prevented anything from growing on the ground beneath it for centuries. You sit on one of its exposed roots that rises from the soil like the back of a buried animal, and you look up through the dark needles at the grey sky and feel the cool air on your face and think about nothing in particular, only the small, pleasant tiredness in your legs, and the quiet of the road, and the fact that the charcoal on the cart behind you is good and will be received well at the ironworks. After a while you rise and continue, the cart creaking back into motion, the road unwinding ahead of you through the trees. The ironworks appears gradually as you approach, not as a single large building, but as a collection of low stone structures scattered along the bank of a stream that has been dammed to form a small pond for the water wheel. The wheel is turning today, its wooden paddles slapping gently against the water, and its axle groaning in a steady rhythm that you can hear from 100 paces away, and the thin column of smoke rising from the furnace chimney tells you that the works are in operation and the furnace master will need charcoal. The buildings are old and weathered, their stone walls blackened by decades of smoke, and the ground around them is bare of vegetation, trampled into hard, dark earth by the feet of workers and the hooves of horses that have carried iron out of the forest for longer than anyone living can remember. You guide the cart through the open gateway between 2 low walls and into the yard where a man in a leather apron is stacking pig iron bars beside the furnace shed, and he looks up at your approach and nods in recognition. The exchange that follows is quiet and efficient, the way all exchanges are between people who've known each other for a long time and have no need for elaborate negotiation. The furnace master examines a piece of your charcoal, turning it over in his hands and tapping it against the stone wall to hear its ring, and he grunts with what you understand to be approval before naming the amount he will give you for the 5 sacks. The amount is fair, the same as it has been for the past several burns: a small bag of salt and a sack of rye flour and a length of good woolen cloth that you will use to make a new tunic for the coming winter, and you accept without discussion, because discussion has never been part of the arrangement. The furnace master's helpers unload the charcoal while you and the master stand aside and talk about the things that people talk about when they have known each other for years but do not see each other often. The quality of the recent charcoal burns in the forest, the water level in the stream that drives the wheel, the price of iron at the river port, and whether the mild spring will mean an early summer or a late frost. The conversation does not touch on the war or the king or the armies that move across the land beyond the forest, not because these things are forbidden, but because they belong to a different world, a world that neither of you inhabits and neither of you claims to understand. And after a few minutes the exchange is complete, and the helpers have stacked the charcoal in the shed beside the furnace, and you have your salt and your flour and your cloth packed onto the empty cart for the journey home. The return walk is lighter in body but no different in pace. The same steady stride along the same forest road, the empty cart now rattling slightly more over the stones because it has no weight to hold it steady. The grey sky begins to show signs of breaking as the afternoon progresses, thin patches of paler grey appearing in the east that might become blue later, or might close over again, and the air warms slightly so that by the time you reach the yew tree again, you are comfortable in your tunic without wishing for a cloak. You stop at the yew to drink again from the leather bottle, and as you stand there with the bottle in your hand, you become aware of how quiet the forest is, quieter than usual. The bird's song muted, and the small rustlings of the undergrowth almost absent. The quiet is not threatening, only different, the way the forest sometimes falls silent for reasons known only to itself, and you stand in it for a moment before picking up the cart shaft and continuing along the road toward the track junction that leads to your own part of the wood. By the time you reach your clearing, the afternoon is well advanced, and the light has begun the slow shift toward evening that you know so well. You unload the flour and the salt and the cloth from the cart and carry them to the lean-to where you store them carefully. The flour in a clay pot with a wooden lid to keep out the mice, the salt in a smaller pot wrapped in oiled cloth, the woolen cloth folded neatly on the shelf with your other supplies. The empty cart you return to its shelter at the track junction, pushing it into place under the branch roof and making sure the wheels are clear of the mud, ready for the next burner who needs it. Then you walk back to the clearing and stand for a moment looking at the opened kiln, the dark circle of the floor still covered in a fine layer of charcoal dust, the piles of sacked charcoal still waiting beside the lean-to, the dome reduced to a ring of scattered earth that will need to be gathered and mixed with fresh soil for the next covering. The cycle is nearly complete, the burn finished, the charcoal delivered, and all that remains is to sweep the kiln floor and prepare the ground for the next stack of cordwood that will become the next mound of charcoal and the next long watching in the endless round of your days. You pick up the birch twig broom and begin to sweep, the bristles making a soft, rhythmic sound on the packed earth, while the beeches stand around the clearing in their silent patience, and the sky above them slowly darkens toward another night in the Forest of Dean, where the king is still imprisoned somewhere far away and the charcoal burner tends his kiln, and the world beyond the trees continues on its own course, as distant and as irrelevant as the stars that will soon appear in the clearing sky. The morning after the journey to the ironworks finds you back in the clearing before the sun has fully cleared the eastern tree line, the light still grey and tentative, and the air cool enough that you can see your breath as you walk the familiar path from the spring with the full leather bottle swinging at your side. The opened kiln stands at the center of the clearing like a ruin of some small ancient building, its earth crust scattered in broken chunks around the dark circle of the kiln floor, and the piles of sacked charcoal you left beside the lean-to are still there, their coarse hemp sides dark with the fine black dust that has sifted through the weave. You stop at the edge of the clearing and look at the scene with the calm, assessing gaze you give to everything in your domain, noting the work that needs to be done without any sense of hurry or burden. Only the quiet recognition of the next tasks in the long cycle that never truly ends. The sacked charcoal will need to be moved to the dry store you keep in a small roofed pit near the coppice track. The kiln floor will need to be swept clean and re-leveled. The broken earth crust will need to be gathered and mixed with fresh soil for the next covering, and somewhere in the coppice the hazel stools are already sending up new shoots from the cuts you made weeks ago. The next generation of charcoal wood beginning its slow journey toward the fire. You begin with the charcoal sacks, carrying them two at a time along the narrow path to the storage pit that is little more than a shallow excavation lined with flat stones and roofed with a sloping frame of poles covered in turf. The pit is dry and cool and dark, and you stack the sacks carefully inside, their weight settling against one another with a soft, muffled sound. And when they are all stored, you count them without meaning to count them, your mind registering the number as 18. Full sacks of good charcoal and 4 of the smaller fragments, enough to supply the ironworks for several months of steady smelting if the furnace master keeps the same pace of work. The storage pit is nearly full now, and this gives you a quiet satisfaction that is not about wealth or security in the ordinary sense, but about the simple completeness of having enough, of having done the work and seen it through to its proper end and stored the result where it will keep dry until it is needed. You close the wooden hatch over the pit and scatter a handful of dry leaves over it to help keep the rain out, a small precaution that is probably unnecessary but costs nothing and has become part of the routine over the years. Back in the clearing, you take up the birch twig broom and begin the slow work of sweeping the kiln floor, drawing the bristles across the packed black earth in long, even strokes that raise a fine cloud of charcoal dust into the still morning air. The dust settles on your clothes and your skin and the leaves of the nearest beech saplings, a dark film that will wash away in the next rain, and you work your way from the outer edge of the kiln circle toward the center, gathering the loose fragments of charcoal that were too small to sack and the crumbled earth that fell from the crust during the opening. This sweeping is a meditative task, the broom handle smooth and familiar in your hands, the sound of the bristles a soft shush-shush that blends with the early bird song, and your mind drifts across the surface of the morning without attaching to any single thought. You sweep the charcoal crumbs into a small pile beside the lean-to, where they will be added to the clay pot of dust you keep for mixing with the next batch of covering earth, and you sweep the earth fragments into a separate pile that will go back to the bank at the edge of the clearing, returning to the place they came from, so that nothing is taken from the forest that is not eventually given back. When the kiln floor is clean and smooth, you take the flat wooden shovel and begin scooping the broken earth crust into the leather bucket, carrying load after load back to the low bank at the clearing's edge where you have been digging soil for so many years that the bank has retreated several paces into the tree line. You spread the old earth along the bank face, mixing it with the fresh loam that you will dig for the next covering, and you work the shovel with a steady rhythm that makes your back and shoulders warm with the pleasant exertion of a task that is neither too light nor too heavy. The bank looks almost the same when you have finished as it did when you began, just slightly higher and slightly more even, and you pat the last shovel load into place with the flat of the blade before returning to the clearing and hanging the shovel on its peg under the lean-to. The tools are all in their places now, the rake and the shovel and the bill hook and the broom and the iron rod and the leather bucket, each one hanging or leaning exactly where it belongs. And this orderliness is another small, quiet satisfaction that you register without dwelling on it. The morning has passed into early afternoon while you worked, and you sit on the log seat with your back against the oak and eat a meal of rye bread spread with a thin scraping of the hard cheese. The bread still fresh from the loaf you baked the day before yesterday in the small clay oven beside your hut. The bread is dense and nutty and slightly sour, the way rye bread always is, and you chew it slowly while your eyes rest on the empty kiln floor that is now a dark, level circle of packed earth and old charcoal dust, waiting for the next stack of cordwood. The waiting will not be long because the coppice is ready and the weather is mild and there is no reason to delay the start of a new burn. But you are not in a hurry and will begin tomorrow or perhaps the day after, depending on how the morning feels and whether any other small tasks present themselves. The forest does not rush, and neither do you, because rushing is the enemy of good work and good charcoal, and the quiet order that you maintain in your small corner of the wood. The afternoon light shifts as the clouds thin and thicken overhead, and you spend what remains of the day in the coppice, not cutting wood yet, but walking among the stools to assess the new growth that has appeared since your last visit. The hazel stools you cut 3 weeks ago are already showing the first shoots, tiny green buds that have pushed through the rough bark of the old stools and are reaching upward toward the light with the patient urgency of all growing things. You touch the new shoots gently with your fingers, feeling their cool, smooth surfaces and noting their thickness and their straightness, and you think about the years ahead when these shoots will have grown into poles as thick as your wrist, and another burner, perhaps you or perhaps someone else, will come with a billhook and cut them and stack them and cover them with earth and light them with embers carried in an iron pot. The thought is not sad or nostalgic, but simply true, the way it is true that the stream will continue running and the beeches will continue dropping their leaves each autumn, and the charcoal will continue being made as long as there is wood to burn and iron to smelt. You walk slowly through the coppice, pausing at the different sections to note which areas will be ready for cutting soon and which need another year or two of growth. The field maple you cut on the eastern boundary has regrown with a vigor that surprises you, the new stems already knee-high and thick with leaves, and you make a mental note to thin them later in the season so that the stronger shoots have room to develop. The birch stools near the stream are doing less well, their growth spindly and pale, and you wonder if the water level has risen and made the ground too wet for their roots, a small concern that you file away for future observation. The coppice is a living record of your work and the work of those who came before you, each stool a chapter in a story that goes back further than anyone can remember, and you read this story as you walk, noting the age of the cuts by the thickness of the regrowth, the health of the wood by the color of the leaves, the gaps where a stool has finally died and a new sapling has seeded itself to take its place. The evening comes gently, the grey sky darkening into a deeper grey and then into a soft black that is not quite dark enough to hide the shapes of the trees, and you walk back to your hut along the path that is now so familiar you could follow it in the deepest sleep. The hut is warm inside from the small fire you lit in the hearth before leaving this morning, the embers still glowing faintly under a layer of ash, and you add a few sticks of dry hazel and blow gently until a small flame appears and begins to eat into the wood. The firelight fills the small space with a warm orange glow that flickers on the wattle walls and the clay-sealed roof, and you sit on the bed of dried bracken and watch the flames while the night settles around the hut, and the forest falls silent except for the distant hoot of the tawny owl that you have heard so many times it has become a kind of clock, marking the hours of the darkness with its patient call. The fire burns down to embers while you sit, and you let your thoughts drift across the surface of the evening without holding on to any of them, the way you might watch leaves float on the surface of a stream. You think about the new kiln you will build, the wood you will cut tomorrow or the next day, the long watching that lies ahead, and these thoughts are not plans exactly, but more like memories of the future, so familiar and so certain that they require no effort of anticipation. You think about the king imprisoned in his distant castle, a fact you know but do not feel, and you wonder without any real curiosity whether he will ever return to his throne, or whether the war will continue for another season, or whether it will end and something else will take its place. These questions have no answers that concern you, because whatever happens beyond the forest, the coppice will still need cutting, and the kiln will still need tending, and the charcoal will still need sacking and carrying to the ironworks, the cycle continuing regardless of the names and the disputes and the outcomes that fill the heads of men in the world outside. The fire dies to a single orange eye that stares up at you from the ash, and you pull the blanket over yourself and lie down on the bracken that rustles softly as you settle. The hut is dark now except for that one small blow, and you watch it fade slowly as the last of the wood is consumed, fading from orange to red to a deep pulsing crimson and then to black. The silence that follows is complete, except for the sound of your own breathing, and you lie still and let the darkness hold you in its calm, weightless palm. The night passes as all nights pass, slowly and then all at once, and you sleep without dreams in the hut that has sheltered you for more years than you can count, the forest standing around you in its ancient patience while the stars wheel overhead and the stream runs on over its stones, and the charcoal waits in its dark pit for the day when it will be burned again, in another fire and transformed into something new. The morning that follows is the same as every morning, the grey light seeping through the gap in the door, leather and the blackbird singing in the oak behind the hut, and the cool air on your face as you push aside the flap and step out into the forest that is your home and your work, and the only world that truly matters. You drink from the spring and splash water on your face, and then you walk the path to the clearing where the empty kiln floor waits, and the tools hang in their places under the lean-to, and the bank of covering earth stands ready at the edge of the trees. The cycle begins again without ceremony or announcement. The same slow, measured actions under the same patient sky, the billhook in your hand and the coppice ahead of you, and the forest holding everything in its quiet, enduring embrace. The charcoal burner tends his kiln, and the king remains imprisoned, and the seasons turn above the grey-green canopy of the Forest of Dean, which asks nothing and gives everything and continues on its ancient way, as it has always done and will always do, long after you are gone, and the charcoal you made has been burned to heat a furnace that made an iron pot that fed a family whose name is now forgotten. The whole long chain of cause and effect dissolving back into the earth from which it came, like the fine black dust that settles in the leaves after a burn, and raunched rain its mighty phased